Heart-free grown-ups. The decent made up of despairs and without accomplishing realize a new awakening, which is a reversal of despair. For what we cannot accomplish, what is denied to love, what we have lost in a combination. A decent follows, endless, indestructible. By William Carlos Williams. Patriots. Don't it make you want to go home now? Don't it make you want to go home? All God's children get weary when they roam. Don't it make you want to go home? Don't it want to make you go home? By Joe South. Chapter 10. The Reunion. 1. Bill Diprog gets a cab. The telephone was ringing, bringing him up and out of a sleep too deep for dreams. He groped for it without opening his eyes, without coming more than halfway awake. If it had stopped ringing just then, he would have slipped back down into sleep without a hitch. He would have done it as simply and easily as he had once slipped down the snow-covered hills in McCarran Park on his flexibility flyer. You ran with the sled, threw yourself onto, and down you went, seeming at a speed of sound. You couldn't do that as a grown-up. It racked the hell out of your balls. His fingers walked over the telephone's dial, slipped off, climbed it again. He had a dim perception that it would be Mike Hanlon. Mike Hanlon calling from Derry, telling him he had to come back, telling him he had to remember, telling him they had made a promise. Stan Uris had cut their palms with a silver of Coke bottle, and they made a promise. Except all of that already happened. He had got it in late yesterday afternoon, just before 6 p.m. Actually, he supposed that if he had been the last call on Mike's list, all of them must have gotten in their very time, so might even have spent most of the day here. He himself had been none of them, felt no urge to see any of them. He had simply checked in, gone up to his room, ordered a meal from room service, which he had found he could not eat once it was laid out before him, and then had tumbled into bed and slept dreamlessly until now. Bill cracked one eye open and fumbled for the telephone's handset. It fell off onto the table, and he groped for it, opened his other eye. He felt totally blank inside his head, totally unplugged, running on batteries. He finally managed to scoop up the phone. He got up on one elbow and put it against his ear. Hello, Bill. It was Mike Hanlon's voice. He'd had at least that much right. Last week he didn't remember Mike at all, and now a single word was enough to identify him. It was rather marvelous, but in an ominous way. Yeah, Mike. Woke you up, huh? Yeah, you did. That's okay. On the wall above the TV was an asylum painting of lobster men in yellow slickers and rain hats, pulling lobster traps. Looking at it, Bill remembered where he was, the Derry townhouse on the upper Main Street. Half a mile farther up across the street was Basie Park, the Kissin Bridge, the canal. What time is it, Mike? 10:15. What day? The 30. Mike sounded a little amused. Yeah, okay. I've arranged a little reunion, Mike said. He sounded defeated now. Yeah, Bill swung his legs out of bed. They all came. All but Stan Uris, Mike said. Now, there was something in his voice that Bill could have read. Bev was the last one. She got in the late last evening. Why do you say the last one, Mike? Stan might show up today. Bill, Stan's dead. What? How? Did his plane? Nothing like that, Mike said. Look, if it's all the same to you, I think I ought to wait until we get there. It would be better if I could tell all of you at the same time. It has to do with this. Yeah, I think so, Mike paused briefly. I'm sure it does. Bill felt the familiar weight of dread settle around his heart. Again, was it something you could get used to so quickly then? Or had it been something he had cried all along, simply unfelt and unthought of, like the inevitable fact of his own death? He reached for his cigarettes, lit one, and blew out the match with the first drag. None of them got together yesterday? No, I don't believe so. And you haven't seen any of us yet? No. Just talk to you on the phone. Okay, he said. Where's the reunion? You remember where the old ironworks used to be? Pastriot Road, sure. You're behind the Times old chums. That's Mall Road these days. We got the third biggest shopping mall in the state out there. 48 different merchants under one roof for your shopping. Convincing. Sounds really American, all right. Bill, what? You all right? Yes, but his heart was beating too fast. The tip of the cigarette jittering a tiny bit. He had stuttered. Mike had heard it. This was a moment of silence, and then Mike said, just out past the mall, there's a restaurant called Jade of the Orient. They have private rooms for parties. I arranged for one of them yesterday. We can have it in the whole afternoon, if we want it. You think this might take that long? I just don't know. A cab will know how to get there. Sure. All right, Bill said. He wrote the name of the restaurant down on the pad by the phone. Why there? Because it's new, I guess, Mike said slowly. It seemed like, I don't know, neutral ground, Bill suggested. Yes, I guess that's it. Food any good? I don't know, Mike said. How's your appetite? Bill coughed out smoke and half laughed, half coughed. It ain't good, old pal. Yeah, Mike said. I hear you. Noon? More like one, I guess. We'll let Beverly catch a few more Z's. Bill snuffled the cigarette. She married? Mike hesitated again. We'll catch up on everything, he said. Just like when you go back to your high school reunion 10 years later, huh? Bill said. You get to see who got fat, who got bald, who got kids. I wish it was like that, Mike said. Yeah, me too, Mikey. Me too. He hung up the phone, took a long shower, and ordered a breakfast that he didn't want and wish he only picked out. No, his appreciated was really not much good at all. Bill dialed the big yellow cab company and asked to be picked up at 1:15, thinking that 15 minutes would be plenty of time to get him out to Pastriot Road. He found himself totally unable to think of it as Mall Road, even when he actually saw the mall. But he had underestimated the lunch hour traffic flow and how much Derry had grown. In 1957, it had been a big town, not much more. There were maybe 30,000 people inside the Derry Incorporated city limits, and maybe another 7,000 beyond that in the surrounding burgs. Now it had become a city, a very small city by London or New York standards, but doing just fine by Maine standards, where Portland, the state's largest, could boast barely 300,000 as the cab moved slowly down Main Street. We're over the canal now, Bill thought. Can't see it, but it's down there, running in the dark. And that turned-up center, his first thought, was predictable enough. How much had changed, but the predictable thought was accompanied by a deep dismay that he never would have expected. He remembered his childhood here as a fearful, nervous time, not only because of the summer of '58, when the 7 of them had faced the terror, but because of George's death. The deep dream his parents seemed to have fallen into following the death. The consents ragging about his standards. Bowers and Huggins and Chris constantly on the prowl for them after the rock fight in the Barrens. Bowers and Huggins and Chris. Oh my, Bowers and Huggins and Chris. Oh my. And just a feeling that Derry was cold, that Derry was hard, that Derry didn't much give a shit if any of them lived or died, and certainly not if they trumpeted over Pennywise the Clown. Derry folk had lived with Pennywise and all his guesses for a long time, and maybe in some mad way they had even come to understand him, to like him, need him, love him. Maybe, yes, maybe that too. So why this dismay? Perhaps only because it seemed just dull change, somehow, or perhaps because Derry seemed to lost its essential face for him. The Bonjour feeder was gone, replaced with a parking lot by permit only. The sign over the ramp announced, "Violator subjects to tow." The shoe boat and Bailey's lunch, which had stood next to it, were also gone. They had been replaced by a branch of the Northern National Bank. A digital readout jutted from the front of the bald, cinder block structure, showing the time and the temperature, the latter in the both degrees Fahrenheit and degrees Celsius. the Center Street drug lair of Mr. Keene, and the place where Bill had gotten Eddie his asthma medicine that day was almost gone. Richard's Alley had become some strange hybrid called a mini mall. Looking inside as the cab idled at the spotlight, Bill could see a record shop, a national food store, and a toys and game shop, which was featuring a clerkship sale on all Dungeons and Dungeons supplies. The cab pulled forward with a jerk. Gonna take a while, the driver said. I wish all those goddamn banks would stagger their lunch hours. Pardon my French if you're a religious man. That's all right, Bill said. I was overcast outside, and now a few splatters of rain hit the cab's windshield. The radio muttered about an escaped mental patient from somewhere who was supposed to be very dangerous, and then began muttering about the Red Sox, who weren't. Showers early, then clearing. When Barry Molyneux began moaning about Mandy, who came and who gave, without taking the cabbie snap. The radio off, Bill asked. When did they go up? What? The banks? Uh-huh. Oh, late 60s, early Sabinus, most of them, the cabbie said. He was a big man with a thick neck. He wore a red and black checked hunter's jacket. A flourish orange cap was jammed down squarely on his head. It was smudged with engine oil. They got his urban Renoil money. Reb insurance, they call it. So how they share it was rip down everything, and the banks come in. I guess that was all they could afford to come in. Hell of a no, ain't it? Urban renewal, says they. Shit for diners, says, I pardon my French if you're a religious man. There was a lot of talk about how they was gonna relicense the downtown. I up. The relicense is just fine. Tore down most of the old stores and put up a lot of banks and parking lots. And you still can't find a fucking slot to park your car in. Out the strings, the whole city colonel up by their cocks, except for the Pollock woman that's on it. String her up by her tits. On second thought, it don't seem like she's got any, flat as a fucking board. Pardon my French if you're a religious man. I am, Bill said, grinning. Then get out of my cab and go to fucking church, the cabbie said. And they both burst out laughing. You lived here long? Bill asked. My whole life, born in Derry Home Hospital. And they'll bury my fucking remains out in Mount Hope Cemetery. Good deal, Bill said. Yeah, all right, the cabbie said. He hawked, rolled down his window, and spat an extremely large yellow-green lunger into the rainy air. His attitude contrary, but somehow attractive. Almost Pinquick was one of the glum good cheer. Guy who catches that won't have to buy no fucking chewing gum for a week. Pardon my French if you're a religious man. It hasn't all changed, Bill said. The depressing, pro-mended of banks and parking lots was slipping behind them as they climbed Center Street over the hill and past the First National. They began to pick up some speed. The Aladdin's still there. Yeah, the cabbie considered it, but just barely. Suckers tried to treat that down, too. For another bank, Bill asked. A part of him, amused to find that another part of him stood against at the idea. He couldn't believe that anyone in his right mind would want to tear down that stately pleasure dome with its glittering glass, chandelier, its sweeping right and left staircases, which spiraled up to the balcony, and its magnificent, which did not simply pull apart when the show started it, but which instead rose in magical folds and trucks and gathers all underlit in fabulous shades of red and blue and yellow and green, while pulleys off stage ratcheted and groaned. Not the Aladdin, that shocked part of him cried out. How could they ever even think of tearing down the Aladdin for a bank? Oh, a bank, the cabbie said. You're a fucking A, pardon my French. If you're a religious man, it was the first mentionance of the Periscott County had its eyes on the Aladdin, wanted to pull it out and put up what they called a complete banking mall, got all the papers from the city cocknell, and the Aladdin was condemned. They, a bunch of folks, formed a consignment folks that had lived here a long time, and they presented and they marched, and they hollered. And finally, they had a public city conical meeting about it, and Hanlon blew those suckers out. The cabbie sounded extremely satisfied. Hanlon? Bill asked, startled. Mike Hanlon. Yep, the cabbie said. He twisted around briefly to look at Bill, revealing a sound, chapped face and horn-rimmed glasses with old specks of white paint on the bows. Liberin, black fella. You know him? I did, Bill said, remembering how he had met Mike back in July 1958. It had been Bowers and Huggins and Chris again. Of course, Bowers and Huggins and Chris. Oh my, at every turn playing their own part. Unwitten, vice grips, driving the seven of them together. Titus. We played together when we were kids, before I moved away. Well, there you go, the cabbie said. It's a small fucking world, pardon my French. If you're a religious man, Bill finished with him. There you go, the cabbie repeated comfortably. And they rode in silence for a while before he said, It's changed a lot, Derry has, but yeah, a lot of it's still here. The town house, where I picked you up, the standpipe in Memorial Park. You remember that place, mister? When we were kids, we used to think that place was haunted. I remember it, Bill said. Look, there's the hospital. You recognize it? They were passing the Derry Home Hospital on the right now. Behind it, the prostitute followed toward its meeting place with the Kansas under the rainy spring sky. The river was dull Putin. The hospital that Bill remembered, a white wood frame, built in with two wings, 3 stories high, was still there, but now it was surrounded and dwarfed by a whole complex of buildings, maybe a dozen in all. He could see a parking lot off to the left and what looked like a better than 500 cars parked there. My God, that's not a hospital. That's a fucking college campus, Bill examined. The cab driver cackled, not being a religious man. I'll pardon your French. Yeah, it's almost as big as the Easter Main-Up in Bangor. They got Regenus Labs and a therapy center and 600 rooms and their own laundry and God knows what else. The old hospital's still there, but it's all admissions now. Bill felt a queer, doubling sensation in his mind. The sort of sensation he remembered getting the first time he watched a 3D movie, trying to bring together 2 images that didn't quite gel. You could fool your eyes and your brain into doing that trick, he remembered, but you were adept to end up with a whopper of a headache, and he could feel his own headache coming on. New Derry fine, but the old Derry was still here, like the wooden home hospital built in the old Derry was mostly buried under all the new concessions, but your eye was somehow dragged helplessly back to look at it, to look for it. The train yard's probably gone, isn't it? Bill asked. The cabbie laughed again, delighted for someone who moved away when he was just a kid. You got a good memory, mister, Bill thought. You should have met me last week, my French-speaking friend. It's all still out there, but it's nothing but ruins and rusty tracks now. The frights don't even stop no more. Fellow wanted to buy the land and put a whole roadside entertainment thing. Pitches putt, batting cages, driving ranges, mini golf, go-karts, little shack full of video games. I don't know what all. But there's some kind of big mix-up about who owns the land now. I guess he'll get it eventually. He's a president fella, but right now, it's in the courts. And the canal, Bill muttered as they turned off Outer Center Street and out to Pasture Road, which, as Mike had said, was now marked with a green roadside reading Mall. The canal's still here. Up, the cabbie said. They'll always be here, I guess. Now the Derry Mall was on Bill's face, left, and as they rolled past it, he felt that queer, doubling sensation again, when they had been kids. All of this had been a great long field full of rank grassy and gigantic nodding sunflowers, which marked the old nursery end of the barrens. Behind it, to the west, was the Old Cape Low Income Housing Development. He could remember them exploring this field, being careful not to fall into the gap in cellar hole on the Kitchener Ironworks, which had exploded on Easter Sunday in the year 1906. The field had been full of relics, and they had unearthed them with all the solemn entries of Ancelotinus, exploring Egypt ruins, bricks, dippers, chunks of iron with rusty bolts hanging from them, panes of glass, bottles full of unnameable gunk that smelled like the worst prison in the world. Something bad had happened near here, too, in the gravel pit close to the dump, but he could not remember it yet. He could only remember a name, Patrick Hubbolton, and that it had something to do with a refrigerator and something about a bird that had chased Mike Hanlon. What? He shook his head. Fragments, straws in the wind. That was all. The field was gone now, as were the remains of the ironworks. Bill remembered the great chimney of the ironworks suddenly faced with title, caked black with soot for the final 10 feet of its ledge. It had lain in the high grass like a gigantic pipe. It had scrambled up somehow and had walked along it, arms held out like tight wire walkers, laughing. He shook his head, as if to dismiss the mirage of the mall, an ugly collection of buildings with signs that said Smears and J.C. Penney and Woolworths and CVS and York Steakhouse and Walden Books and dozens of other roads woven in and out of parking lots. The mall did not go away because it was no mirage. The Kitchener Ironworks was gone, and the field that had grown up around its ruins was likewise gone. The mall was the reality, not the memories. But somehow he didn't believe that. Here you go, mister, the cabbie said. He pulled into the parking lot of a building that looked like a large plastic Pagasoda. A little late, but better than late than ever. Am I right? Indeed you are, Bill said. He gave the cab driver a $5. Keep the change. Good fucking deal, the cabbie examined. You need someone to drive you. Call Big Yellow and ask for Dave. Ask for me by name. I'll just ask you for the religions, fella, Bill said, grinning the one who's got his plot and picked out in Mount Hope. You got it, Dave said, laughing. Have a good one, mister. You too, Dave. He stood in the light rain for a moment, watching the cab draw away. He realized that he had meant to ask the driver one more question and had forgotten, perhaps on purpose. He had meant to ask Dave if he had liked living in Derry. Absolutely. Permanently, Bill Deprog turned and walked into the jade of the Orient. Mike Hanlon was in the lobby, sitting in the wicker chair with the huge flaring back. He got to his feet, and Bill felt deep unreality washed over him, through him. That sensation of Dublin was back, but now it was much, much worse. He remembered a boy who had been about 5 feet free, trim, and diagonal. Before him was a man who stood about 5'7". He was skinny. His clothes seemed to hang on him, and the lines in his face said that he was on the darker side of 40, instead of only 38 or so. Bill's shock must have shown on his face, because Mike said quietly, I know how I look. Bill flushed and said, It's not that bad, Mike. It's just that I remember you as a kid. That's all it is. Is it? You look a little tired. I am a little tired, Mike said, but I'll make it, I guess. He smiled then, and the smile lit his face. In it, Bill saw the boy he had known 27 years ago, as the old wood frame home hospital had been overwhelmed with modern glass and cinder block. So had the boy that Bill had known been overwhelmed with the uninventable association of adulthood. There were wrinkles on his forehead. Lines had grooved themselves from the corners on his mouth, nearly to his chin, and his hair was graying on both sides, above the ears. But the old hospital, although overwhelmed, was still there, still visitable. So was the boy Bill had known. Mike stuck out his hand and said, "Welcome back to Derry, Big Bill." Bill ignored the hand and embraced Mike. Mike hugged him back furiously, and Bill could feel his hair stiff and kinky against his own shoulder and the side of his neck. "Whatever's wrong, Mike, we'll take care of it," Bill said. He heard the rough sound of tears in his throat and didn't care. We beat it once and we could beat it again. Mike pulled away from him, held him at arm's length, although he was still smiling. There was too much sparkle in his eyes. He took out his handkerchief and wiped them. "Sure, Bill," he said. "You bet." Would you gentlemen like to follow me?" the hostess asked. She was a smiling Oriental woman in a delicate pink kimono upon which a dragon conjured a curled its plaited tail. Her dark hair was piled high on her head and held with ivory combs. "I know the way, Rose," Mike said. "Very good, Mr. Hanlon," she smiled at both of them. "You are well met in friendship, I think." "I think we are," Mike said. "This way, Bill." He led down a dim corridor, past the main dining room, and toward a door where a bearded servant hugged. "The others," Bill began. "All here now," Mike said. "All that could come." Bill hesitated for a moment outside the door, suddenly frightened. It was not the unknown that scared him, not the supernatural. It was the simple knowledge that he was 15 inches taller than he had been in 1958 and minus most of his hair. He was suddenly uneasy, almost terrified at the thought of seeing them all again. Their children's faces, almost wore away, almost buried under change as the old hospital had been buried. Banks erected inside their heads, where once magic pictured Palliser had stood. "We grew up," he thought. "We didn't think would happen. Not them. Not to us. But it did. And if I go in there, we'll be real. We're all grown-ups now." He looked at Mike, suddenly bewildered and Tim. "How do they look?" he heard himself asking in a flattering voice. "Mike, how do they look?" "Come in and find out," Mike said, kindly through, and led Bill into the small, private room. 2. Bill Dubrog gets a look. Perhaps it was simply the demons of the room that caused the hallucinations, which lasted for only the briefest moment. But Bill wondered later if it was some sort of message meant strictly for him, that fate could also be kind. In that brief moment, it seemed to him that none of them had grown up, that his friends had somehow done a Peter Pan act and were all still children. Richie Tozer was rocked back in his chair so that he was leaning against the wall, caught in the act of saying something to Beverly Marsh, who had a hand cupped over her mouth to have a giggle. Richie had a wise-ass grin on his face that was perfectly familiar. There was Eddie Kasprak sitting on Beverly's left, and in front of him on the table, next to his water glass, was a plastic squeeze bottle with a pistol grip handle curving down from its top. The trimmings were a little more state-of-the-art, but the purpose was obviously the same. It was an aspiranter sitting at one end of the table, watching this trio with an expression of mixed anxiety, amusement, and condescension was Ben Hanscom. Bill found his hand wanting to go to his head and realized with a sorry kind of amusement that in that second he had almost rubbed his paint to see if his hair had magically come back, that red fine hair that he had begun to lose when he was only a college sophomore. That broke the bubble. Richie was not wearing glasses. He saw it and thought he probably has contacts now. He hated those glasses. The T-shirts and cord pants he hurriedly wore had been replaced by a suit that hadn't been purchased off any rack. Bill estimated that he was looking at $900 worth of tailor-made on a hoof. Beverly Marsh, if her name was still Marsh, had been a stunningly beautiful woman instead of the causal ponytail. Her hair, which was almost exactly the same shade his own had been, spilled over the shoulders of her pale, white ship-to-shore blouse in a torrent of subdued color. In his dim light, it merely glowed like a well-blanked bed of embers. In daylight, even the light of such a stubborn day as this one, Bill imagined it would flame, and he found himself wondering that it would feel like to plunge his hand into that hair. The world's oldest story, he thought wildly. I love my wife, but oh, you kid. Eddie, it was weird, but true, had grown up to look quite a bit like Anthony Perkins. His face was permanently lined, although in his movements he seemed somehow younger than either Richie or Ben, and made older still by the rimless spectacles he wore. Spectacles you would imagine a British barrister wearing as he approached the bench or leafed through a legal brief. His hair was short, worn in out-of-date style that had been known as Ivy League in the late 50s and early 60s. He was wearing a loud check sport coat that looked like something grabbed from the distress sale rack of a men's clothing store that would shortly be out of business. But the watch on one wrist was a Patek Philippe, and the ring on the little finger of his right hand was a ruby. The stone was too hugely vulgar and too obsession to be anything but real. Ben was the one who had really changed, and looking at him again, Bill felt unreality wash easily over him. His face was the same, and his hair, although graying and longer, was combed in the same unusual right side part. But Ben had gotten thin. He sat easily enough in his chair, his unadorned leather vest open to show the blue Charlebran work shirt beneath. He wore levis with straight legs, cowboy boots, and a wide belt with a beaten silver buckle. These clothes clung easily to a body which was slim and narrow-hipped. He wore a bracelet with heavy links on one wrist, not gold links, but copper ones. He got thin, Bill thought. He's a shadow of his former self, so to speak. Old Ben got thin. Wonders never cease. There was a moment of silence among the six of them that was beyond description. It was one of the strangest moments Bill Debrug ever passed in his life. Stan was not there, but a seventh had come. Nonetheless, here in his private restaurant dining room, Bill felt its presence so fully that it was almost impersonified, but not as an old man in a white robe with a sack on his shoulder. It was the white spot on the map, which laid between 1958 and 1985, an area an explorer might have called the Great Don't Know. Bill wondered what exactly was there. Beverly Marsh in a short skirt which showed most of her long, colorless legs, a Beverly Marsh in white go-go boots, her hair parted in the middle and ironed. Richie Tozier carried a sign which said, "Stop the war" on one side and get Roddick off campus on the other. Ben Hanscom in a yellow hard hat with a flag decal on the front, running a bulldozer under a Canvan's personal, his shirt off, showing a stomach which protruded less and less over the wristband of his pants. Was this seven creature black? No realization to either H. Rap Brown on or Grandmaster Flash. Not this fellow. This fellow wore pants, white shirt, and fade into the woodwork. See penny slacks, and he had in a library curl at the University of Maine, writing papers on the origins of footnotes and the possible average of ISBN numbers in book cataloging, while the marchers marched outside and Phil Ox sang, "Richard Nixon, find yourself another country to be part of," and men died with their stomachs blowed out for villages, those whose names they could not pronounce. He sat there stridently bent over his work. Bill saw him, which lay in a slant of crisp, white winter light, his face sober and absorbed, knowing that to be a librarian was to come as close as any human being can to sitting in the peak seat of Internet's engines. Was he the seventh, or was it a young man standing before his mirror, looking at the way his forehead was growing, looking at a combo of pulled-out red hairs, looking at a pile of university notebooks on the desk reflected in the mirror, notebooks which held the completed, messy first draft of a novel entitled Joanna, which would be published a year later. Some of the above, all the above, none of the above. It didn't matter, really. The stuff was there, and it did not one moment. They all felt it and perhaps understood. Best the dreadful power of the thing that had brought them back. It lives. Bill fought cold inside his clothes. Eye of a newt, tail of dragon, hand of glory, whatever it was. It's here again in Derry. It. And it felt suddenly that it was the seventh, that it and time were somehow interchangeable, that it wore all their faces as well as the thousand others which each it had terrified and killed, and the idea that it might been them was somehow the most frightening idea of all. How much of us was left behind here? He fought with sudden rising terror. How much of us never left the drains and the sewers where it lived and where it fed? Is that why we forgot? Because of the part each of us never had any further, never grew, never left Derry? Is that why? He saw no answers on their face, only his own questions reflected back at him. Thoughts form and pass in a matter of seconds or milliseconds and created their own time frames, and all of his passed through Bill Debrog's mind in a space of no more than 5 seconds. Then Richie Tozier, leaning back against the wall, grinned again and said, "Oh my, look at this." Bill Debrog went for the chrome dome. "Look, how long you been turtle waxing your head, Big Bill?" And Bill, with no idea at all of what might come out, opened his mouth and heard himself say, "Fuck you, and the horse you rode in on, trash mouth." There was a moment of silence, and then the room exploded with laughter. Bill crossed to them and began to shake hands, and while there was something horrible in what he now felt, there was also something comforting about it, this sensation of having come home for good. 3. Ben Hanscom gets skinny. Mike Hanlon ordered drinks, and as if to make up for the prisoner's centralism, everyone began to talk at once. Beverly Marsh was now Beverly Rogan. It turned out she said she was married to a wonderful man in Chicago who had turned her whole life around and who had, by some beginning magic, been able to transform his wife's sample talent pursuing into successful dress business. Eddie Casrick owned a luminous company in New York. "For all I know, my wife could be in bed with Al Pacino right now," he said, smiling medley, and the room broke up. They all knew what Bill and Ben had been up to, but Bill had a peculiar sense that there had been no personal association of their names. Ben, as an archer in himself, as a writer with people they had known as children until very, very recently. Beverly had paperback copies of Joanna and the Black Rapids in her purse and asked him if he would sign them. Bill did so, noticing as he did that both books were in mint condition, as if they had been purchased in the airport newsstands. As she got off the plane, in like fashion, Richie told Ben how much he had admired the BBC Communications Centre in London, but there was a puzzled sort of light in his eyes, as he could not quite recolonize that building with his man, or with the fat earnest boy who had shown them how to flood out half the barrens with skirmishing boards and a rusty car door. Richie was a disc jockey in California. He told them he was known as the man of 1,000 voices, and Bill groaned. "God, Richie, your voices were always so terrible." "Flattering will get you nowhere, Master," and Richie replied loafily. And Beverly asked him if he wore contacts now. Richie said in a low voice, "Come a closer, baby. Look in my eyes," Beverly did, and examined, delighted as Richie tilted his head a little so she could see the lower rims of the hideous soft lenses he wore. "Is the library still the same, Ben?" asked Mike Hanlon. Mike took out his wallet and produced a snap of the library taken from above. He did it with the proud air of a man producing snapshots of his kids. When asked about his family, "Guy in a light plane took this," he said, as the pictures went from hand to hand. "I've been trying to get either the City Chronicle or some well-heeled private Just suddenly enough cash to get it blowed up to Merle's size for the children's library. So far, no soap, but it's a good picture, huh? They all agreed that it was. Ben held it longest, looking at it fixatively. Finally, he tapped the glass corner door which connected the two buildings. Do you recognize this from anywhere else, Mike? Mike smiled. It's your communication center, he said, and all six of them burst out laughing. The drinks came. They sat down. That silence, sudden, awkward, and perplexed, and fell again. They looked at each other. Well, Beverly asked in her sweet, silent, husky voice, what do we drink to? To us, Richie said suddenly, and now he wasn't smiling. His eyes caught Bill's, and with a force so great he could barely deal with it. Bill remembered himself and Richie in the middle of Neobolt Street after the thing which might have been a clown or which might have been a werewolf had disappeared, embracing each other and weeping. When he picked up his glass, his hand was trembling, and some of his drink spilled on the napery. Richie rose slowly to his feet, and one by one to other followed suit. Bill first, then Ben and Eddie, Beverly, and finally Mike Hanlon. To us, Richie said, and like Bill's hand, his voice trembled a little. To the Losers Club, Club of 1958. The Losers, Bill Beverly said, slightly amused. The Losers, Eddie said. His face was pale and old behind his women's glasses. The Losers, Ben agreed, and a painful smile ghosted at the corner of his mouth. The Losers, Mike Hanlon said softly. The Losers, Bill finished. Their glasses touched. They drank. That silence fell again, and this time Richie did not break it. This time the silence seemed necessary. They sat back down, and Bill said, so spill it, Mike. Tell us what's been happening here, and what we can do. Eat first, Mike said. We'll talk afterwards. So they ate, and they ate long and well, like that old joke about the commandant man. Bill thought, but his own appetite was better than it had been in ages since he was a kid. He was tempted to think the food was not stunningly good, but it was far from bad, and there was a lot of it. The six of them began trading stuff back and forth surreptitiously. Moo Goo Gone Pad, chicken wings that had been delicately braised egg rolls, water chestnuts wrapped in bacon, strips of beef that had been threaded onto wooden skewers. They began with platters, and Richie made a childish but amusing business of broiling a little bit of everything over the flaming pot in the center of the platter. He was sharing with Beverly, including half an egg roll and a few red kidney beans. Flamed it at my table. I love it, he told Ben. I eat shit on a shingle. It was flamed at my table. And probably has, Bill remarked. Beverly laughed so hard at this she had spit a mouthful of food into her napkin. Oh, God, I think I'm going to Ralph, Richie said in an eerily excited emanation of Don Porto. And Beverly laughed harder, blushing a bright red. Stop it, Richie, she said. I'm warning you. The warning is taken, Richie said. Eat well, dear. Rose herself brought them their dessert, a great mound of bake, Alaska, which she chickened at the head of the table where Mike sat. More flame be at my table, Richie said in a voice of a man who has died and gone to heaven. This may be the best meal I've ever eaten in my life. But of course, Rose said determinedly. If I blow that out, do I get my wish, she asked her. At Jade of the Oret, all wishes are granted, sir. Richie smiled, flattered. Suddenly, I applaud the cemented, he said. But you know, I really doubt the virtually. They almost demolished the baked Alaska as Bill sat back, his belly straining the waistband of his pants. He happened to notice the glasses on the table. There seemed to be hundreds of them. He grinned a little, realizing that he himself had sunk 2 Murritons before the meal, and God knew how many bottles of Crin beer with it. The others had done about as well in their state. Fried chunks of bull and pin would probably have tasted it okay. And yet he didn't feel drunk. I haven't eaten like that since I was a kid, Ben said. They looked at him, and a faint flush of color tinged his cheeks. I mean it literally. That may be the biggest meal I've eaten since I was a sophomore in high school. You went on a diet, Eddie asked. Yeah, Ben said. I did. The Ben Hanscom Freedom Diet. What got you going? Richie asked. You don't want to hear all that ancient history, Ben shifted uncomfortably. I don't know about the rest of them, Bill said, but I do. Come on, Ben. Give. What turned Haystack Coleman into the magazine model we seen before us today? Richie snorted a little. Haystack right. I've forgotten that. It's not much of a story, Ben said. No story at all. Really, after that summer, after 1958. We stayed in Derry another 2 years. Then my mom lost her job, and we ended up moving to Nebraska because she had a sister there who offered to take us in until my mother got on her feet again. It wasn't so great. Her sister, my Aunt Jean, was a miserly bitch who had to keep telling me, you want your place in the great submissions of things was how lucky we were that my mom had a sister who could give us charity, how lucky we were not to be on welfare, all that sort of thing. I was so fat, I disgusted her. She couldn't leave it alone. Ben, you out to get more exercise. Ben, you'll have a heart attack before you're 40 if you don't lose weight. Ben, with little children starving in the world, you out to be ashamed of yourself. He paused for a moment and sipped some water. The thing was, she almost trotted the starving children out if I didn't clean my plate. Richie laughed and nodded. Anyway, the country was just pulling out of the richness, and my mother was almost a year finding steady work. By the time we moved out of Aunt Jean's place in La Vista and got your own in Amana, I put about 90 pounds over. When you guys knew me, I think I put on most of it just to spite my Aunt Jean. Eddie whistled. That would have put you at about 210, Ben said gravely. Anyway, I was going to East Side High School in Omaha, and the pies ed periods were, well, pretty bad. The other kids called me Jogs. That ought to give you the idea. The ragging went on for about 7 months, and then one day while we were getting dressed in the locker room after the period 2 or 3 of the guys started to kind of slap my guts. They called me a fat platin. Pretty soon 2 or 3 others got in on it. Then 4 or 5 more. Pretty soon it was all of them chasing me around the locker room and up the hall, whacking my gut, my butt, my back, my legs. I got scared and started to scream. That made the rest of them laugh like crazy. You know, he said, looking down and carefully rearranging his silverware. That's the last time I can remember thinking of Henry Bowers until Mike called me 2 days ago. The kid who started it was a farm boy with these big old hands, and while they were chasing after me, I remember thinking that Henry had come back. I know, that's when I panicked. They chased me up the hall past the lockers where the guys who played sports kept their stuff. I was naked and red as a lobster. I'd lost any sense of dignity or of myself. I guess you'd say where myself was. I was screaming for help. And there, they came after me, screaming, fat puddin', fat paddin', fat peddlin'. There was a bench. Ben, you don't have to put yourself through this, Beverly said. Suddenly, her face had gone ashy play. She toyed with her water glass and almost spilled it. Let him finish, Bill said. Ben looked at him for a moment and then nodded. There was a bench at the end of the corridor. I fell over it and hit my head. They were all around me in another minute or two, and then this voice said, okay, that's enough. You guys go change up. It was Coach standing there in the doorway, wearing his blue sweatpants with the white stripe up the sides and his white T-shirt. There was no way of telling how long he'd been standing there. They all looked at him, some of them grinning, some of them guilty, some of them just looking sort of vacant. They went away, and I burst into tears. Coach just stood there in the doorway, leading back to the gym, watching me, watching this naked fat boy with his skin all red from the fat platinum, watching this fat kid crying on the floor. And he said, Benny, why don't you just fucking shut up? It shocked me so much to hear a teacher use that word that I did. I looked up at him, and he came over and sat down on the bench. I'd fallen over. He leaned over me, and the whistle around his neck swung out and bonked me on the forehead. For a second, I thought he was going to kiss me or something, and I shrank back from him. But what he did was grab one of my tits in each hand and squeeze Then he took his hand away and rubbed them on his pants like he touched something dirty. You think I'm going to comfort you? He asked me. I'm not. You discussed them. You discussed me as well. We got differences, reasons, but that's because they're kids and I'm not. They don't know why you discussed them. I do know. It's because I see you burying the good body God gave you in a great big mess of fat. It's a lot of stupid self-indulgence, and it makes me want to puke. Now listen to me, Benny, because this is the only time I'm going to say to you, I've got a football team to the coach in basketball and track, and somewhere in between. I've got swimming team, so I'll just say it once. You're fat up here. And he tapped my forehead right. There his damn whistle had bonked me. That's where everybody's fat. You put what's between your ears on a diet, and you're going to lose weight. But guys like you never do. What a bastard, Beverly said emergently. Yeah, Ben said, grinning, but he didn't know he was a bastard. That's how dumb he was. He'd probably seen Jack Webb in that movie, The D.I., about 60 times, and he actually thought he was doing me a favor. And as it turned out, he was, because I thought of something right then. I thought. He looked away, frowning, and Bill had the strangest feeling that he knew what Ben was going to say before he said it. I told you that the last time I can remember thinking of Henry Bowers was when the other boys were chasing after me and Fat Platinum. Well, when the coach was getting up to go, that was the last time I really thought of what we'd done in the summer of 58. I thought. He hesitated, looking at each of them, and turned seeming to search their faces. He went on carefully. I thought of how good we were together. I thought of what we did and how we did it. And all at once it hit me that if Coach had to face anything like that, his hair would probably have turned white all at once, and his heart would have stopped dead in his chest like an old watch. Wasn't fair, of course, but he hadn't been fair to me. What happened was simple enough. You got mad, Bill said. Ben smiled. Yeah, that's right, he said. I called, Coach. He turned around and looked at me. You said you coach track? I asked him. That's right, he said. Not that it's anything to you. You listen to me, you stupid stone-brained son of a bitch. I said, and his mouth dropped open and his eyes bugged out. I'll be out there for the track team in March. What do you think about that? I think you better shut your mouth before it gets into big trouble, he said. I'm going to run down everyone you get out, I said. I'm going to run down your best. And then I want a fucking apology from you. His fists clenched, and for a minute I thought he was going to come back in there and let me have it. Then they unclenched again. You just keep talking, fat boy, he said softly. You got the motor mouth, but the day you can outrun my best will be the day I quit this place and go back to picking corn on the circuit. And he left. You lost the weight, Richie asked. Well, I did, Ben said, but Coach was wrong. It didn't start in my head. It started with my mother. I went home that night and told her I wanted to lose some weight. He ended up having a hell of a fight. Both of us crying. She started out with that same old song and dance. It wasn't really fat. I just had big bones, and a big boy who was going to be a big man had to eat big just to stay even. It was a kind of security thing with her, I think. It was scary for her trying to raise a boy on her own. She had no education and no real skills, just a willingness to work hard. And when she could give me a second helping, or when she could look across the table at me and see that I was looking solid, she felt like she was winning the battle, Mike said. Uh-huh. Ben drank off the last of his beer and wiped a small mustache of foam off his upper lip with the heel of his hands. So the biggest fight wasn't with my head. It was with her. She wouldn't accept it, not for months. She wouldn't take in my clothes, and she wouldn't buy me new ones. I was running by then. I ran everywhere, and sometimes my heart pounded so hard I felt like I was going to pass out. The first of my mile runs, I finished by puking and then fading. Then, for a while, I just puked, and after a while, I was holding up my pants while I ran. I got a paper route and I ran it with a bag around my neck, bouncing against my chest, while I held up my pants. My shirt started to look like sails. And nights, when I went home and would only eat half the stuff on my plate, my mother would burst into tears and say that I was starving myself, killing myself, that I didn't love her anymore, that I didn't care about how hard she had worked for me. Christ, Richie muttered, lighting a cigarette. I don't know how you handled it, Ben. I just kept the coach's face in front of me. Ben said. I just kept remembering the way he looked after he grabbed my tits in the hallway to the boys' locker room. That time, that's how I did it. I got myself some new jeans and stuff with the paper route money, and the old guy in the first floor apartment used his owl to punch some new holes in my belt. About 5 of them. As I remember, I think that I might have remembered the other time I had to buy a pair of new jeans. That was when Henry pushed me into the barrens that day. And they just about got torn off my body. Yeah, Eddie said, grinning. And you told me about the chocolate milk late. Remember that? Ben nodded it, if I did remember. He went on. It was just for a second. There and gone about that same time, I started taking health and nutrition at school. And I found out you could eat just about all the raw green stuff you wanted it and not gain weight. So one night, my mother put on a salad with lettuce and raw spinach and chunks of apples and maybe a little leftover ham. Now, I've ever liked rabbit food that much, but I had free helpings and just rave on and on to my mother about how good it was. That went a long way towards solving the problem. She didn't care so much what I ate, as long as I ate a lot of it. She buried me in salads. I ate them for the next 3 years. There was a times when I had to look in the mirror to make sure my nose wasn't wriggling. So what happened about the coach, Eddie asked. Did you go out for track? He touched his aspiratin as if the thought of running had remained him of it. Oh yeah, I went out, Ben said. The 220 and the 440. By then, I lost 70 pounds and I'd sprung up 2 inches, so that what was left was better distributed. On the first day of trials, I won the 220 by 6 ledge and the 440 by 8. Then I went over to Coach, who looked mad enough to chew nails and spit out staples. And I said, look like it's time you got on the circuit and started picking corn. When are you heading down, Kansas way? He didn't say a thing at first, just swung a roadhouse and knocked me flat on my back. Then he told me to get off the field, said he didn't want a smart-mouthed bastard like me on his track team. I wouldn't be on it if President Kennedy appointed me to it. I said, wiping blood out of the corner of my mouth. And since you got me going, I won't hold you to do it. But the next time you sit down to a big plate of corn on the cob, spare me a thought. He told me if I didn't get out right then, he was going to beat the living crap out of me. Ben was smiling a little, but there was nothing very pleasant about that smile. Certainly nothing nostalgic. Those were exact words. Everyone was watching us, including the kids I'd beaten. They looked pretty embarrassed, so I just said, I'll tell you what, Coach. You get 1 free on account of your sore loser, but too old to learn any better now. But you put 1 more on me, and I'll try to see to it that you lose your job. I'm not sure I can do it, but I can make a good try. I lost the weight so I could have a little dignity and a little peace. Those are things we're fighting for. Bill said, all of that sounds wonderful, Ben, but the writer in me wonders if any kid ever really talked like that. Ben nodded it, still smiling. That particular smile. I doubt if any kid who hadn't been through the things we went through ever did, he said. But I said them, and I meant them. Bill thought about this and then nodded. All right. The coach stood back with his hand on the hips of his sweatpants. Ben said. He opened his mouth and then he closed it again. Nobody said anything. I walked off and that was the last I had to do with Coach Wooligan. When my homeroom teacher handed me my course sheet for my junior high, someone had typed the word excuse next to phys ed. and he'd annihilated it. You beat him, Richie exampled, and shook his clenched hand over his head. Way to go, Ben. Ben shrugged. I think what I did was beat part of myself. Coach got me going, I guess. But it was thinking of you guys that made me really believe that I couldn't do it. And I did do it. Ben shrugged charmingly, but Bill believed he could. See fine drops of sweat at his hairline. End of true confessions. Except I sure could use another beer. Talkins, thirsty work. Mike Single, the waitress. All of 6 of them ended up ordering other round. And they talk of light matters until drinks came. Bill looked into his beer, watching the way the bubbles crawled up the sides of the glass. He was both amused and applaud to realize he was hoping someone else would begin to story about the years between that Beverly would tell them about the wonderful man she had married, even if he was born as most wonderful men were, or that Richie Tozier would begin to expound on funny incidents in the broadcast studio, or that Eddie Kasprak would tell them what Teddy Kamenik was really like, how much Robert Redford tipped, or maybe offer some insights into why Ben had been able to give the extra pounds while he had needed to hang over onto his aspirin. The fact is, Bill thought, Mike is going to start talking any minute now, and I'm not sure I want to hear what he has to say. The fact is, my heart is beating just a little too fast, and my hands are just a little too cold. The fact is, I'm just about 25 years too old to be this scared. We all are. To say something, someone. Let's talk of careers and sclerosis and what it's like to look at your old playmates and realize that you've been taking a few really good shots in the nose from the time itself. Let's talk about sex, baseball, the price of gas, the future of the Warsaw and Pac nations. Anything but what we came here to talk about. So say something. Somebody. Some did, Eddie Kasprak did. But it was not what Teddy Kamenik was really like, or how much Redford tipped, or even why he had found it necessary to keep what Richie had sometimes called Eddie's lung sucker in the old days. He asked Mike when Stan Uris had died, the night before last, when I made the calls. Did it have to do with why we're here? I could beg the question and said he didn't have a no. No one can know for sure. Mike answered, but since it happened almost immediately after I called it, I think the admonition is safe enough. He killed himself, didn't he? Beverly said dully. Oh, God, poor Stanley. The others were looking at Mike, who finished his drink, and said he committed suicide. Yes, apparently went up to the bathroom shortly after I called him, drew a bath, got into it, and cut his wrist. Bill looked down the table, which seemed suddenly lined with chalked, pale face. No bodies, only those faces like white circles, like white Bill's moon balloons. Tever, here by an old promise. That should have long since lapsed. How did you find out, Richie asked. Was it carrying in the purrs up here? No, for some time now. I've subscribed to the newspapers of those town's closet to all of you. I have kept tabs over the years. I spy. Richie's face was sour. Thanks, Mike. It was my job, Mike simply. Poor Stan repeatedly. She seemed stunned, unable to cope with the news. But he was so brave back then, so determined. People change, Eddie said. Do they? Bill asked. Stan was. He moved his hand on the tablecloth, trying to catch the right words. He was an order, pure son, the kind of the person who has to have his book divided up into fiction and non-fiction on his shelves, and then wants to have each section in alphabetical order. I can remember something he said once. I don't remember where we were or what we were doing, at least not yet, but I think it was toward the end of things. He said he could stand to be scared, but he hated being dirty. That seemed to me the essence of Stan. Maybe it was just too much. When Mike called, he saw his choices as being only to stay alive and get dirty or die clean. Maybe people really don't change as much as he thinked. Maybe they just sifted. There was a moment of silence, and then Richie said, "All right, Mike. What's happened in Derry? Tell us. I can tell you some." Mike said, "I can tell you, for instance, what's happening now, and I can tell you some things about your shelves, but I can tell you everything that happened back in the summer of 1958, and I don't believe I'll ever have to. And eventually, you'll remember it for yourselves. And I think if I told you too much before, your minds were ready to remember. What happened to Stan?" "Might happen to us?" Ben asked quietly. Mike nodded it. "Yes, that's exactly what I'm afraid of," Bill said. "Then tell us what you can, Mike." "All right," he said. "I will. 4. The losers get the scoop." "The murders have started again," Mike said flatly. He looked up and down the table, and then his eyes fixed on Bill's. "The first of the new murders, if you'll allow me that rather grisly consent, began on the Main Street bridge and ended underneath it. The victim was a gay and rather childlike man named Adrian Mellon. He had a bad case of asthma. Eddie's hand stole out and touched the side of the aspirin. It happened last summer on July 21st, the last night of the Canal Days Festival, which was kind of a celebration, a dairy ritual," Bill said in a low voice. His long fingers were slowly massaging his temples, and it was not hard to guess. It was thinking about his brother George, who had almost concernedly opened the way the last time this had happened. "A ritual," Mike said quietly. "Yes." He told them the story of what happened to Adrian Mellon quickly, watching with no pleasure as their eyes got bigger and bigger. He told them what the news had reported and what it had not. The latter, including the testimony of Don Haggerty and Christopher Unwin about a certain clown which had been under the bridge like the troll in the fabled story of yore. A clown which had looked like a cross between Ronald McDonald and Bozo. According to Haggerty, it was him, Ben said in a sick, hoarse voice. "It was that fucker Pennywise." "There's one other thing," Mike said, looking at Bill. "One of them investigating officers, the one who actually pulled Adrian Mellon out of the canal, was a town cop named Harold Gardner." "Oh, Jesus Christ," Bill said in a weak, teary voice. "Bill?" Beverly looked at him, then put a hand on his arm. Her voice was full of startled concern. "Bill, what's wrong?" "Harold would have been about 5 then," Bill said. His stunned eyes searched Mike's face for confirmation. "Yes? What is it, Bill?" Richie asked. "Harold Gardner was the son of Dave Gardner," Bill said. "Dave lived down the street from us back then when George was killed. He was the one who got to my brother first and brought him up to the house." Wrapped in the piece of quill, they sat silently. They said nothing. Beverly put a hand briefly over her eyes. "It all fits rather too well, doesn't it?" Mike said finally. "Yes," Bill said in a low voice, "it fits all right. I'd kept tabs on the 6 of you over the years, as I said." Mike went on, but it wasn't until then that I began to understand just why I had been doing it, that it had a real and concerned purpose. Still, I held off, waiting to see how things would develop. You see, I felt that I had to be absolutely sure before I disturbed your lives. Not 90%, not even 95%. 100 was all that wouldn't do it. In December of last year, an 8-year-old boy named Stephen Johnson was found dead in Memorial Park, like Adrian Mellon. He had been badly mutilated just before, or just after his death, but he looked as if he could have died of just plain fright. "Sexually assaulted?" Eddie asked. "No, just plain mutilated." "How many in all?" Eddie asked, not looking as if he really wanted to know. "It's bad," Mike said. "How many?" Bill repeated. 9 so far." "It can't be," Beverly cried. "I would have read about it in the paper, seen it on the news. When that crazy cop killed all those women in the Castle Rock, Maine, and all those children that were murdered in Atlanta." Yes, that, Mike said. "I've thought about that a lot. It's really the closet colors. It's what's going on here." And Bev's right. That really was coast-to-coast news. And somewhat the Atlanta comparisons is the thing about all of this that frightens me the most, the murder of 9 children. We should have TV news corporation here, and phony physics and reporters from the Atlantic Monthly and Rolling Stone, the whole media circus in short. But it wasn't happened, Bill said. No, Mike answered. It hasn't. Oh, there was a Sunday supplement piece about it in the Portland Sunday Telegram, and another one in the Boston Globe after the two. A Boston-based television program called Good Day did a segment this February on unsolved murders, and one of the experts mentioned the Derry murders. And one of the experts mentioned the Derry murders, but the only Passanlin, and he certainly gave no indication of knowing there had been a similar batch of murders in 1957 through 58, and another in 1929 through 30. There are some obsessional reasons, of course. Atlanta, New York, Chicago, Detroit. Those are big media towns. In a big media town, when something happens, it makes a bang. There isn't a single TV or radio station in Derry, unless you count the little FM, the English and Speech Department, runs up at the high school. Bangor's got the corner on the market when it comes to the media, except for the Derry News, Eddie said. And they all laugh, but we all know that doesn't really cut it with the way the world is today. The communication web is there, and at some point the story should have broken nationally, but it didn't. And I think the reason is just this. It doesn't want to do it, want it to. It, Bill mused, almost to himself. It, Mike agreed. If we have to call it something, it might as well be what we used to call it. As begun to think, you see that it was here so long. Whenever it really is, that's it becomes a part of Derry, something as much as a part of the town at the standpipe, or the canal, or Basie Park, or the library, only it's not a matter of outward, geographic. You understand? That was true once, but now it's inside. Somehow it's gotten inside. That's the only way I know to understand all of the terrible things that have happened here, the nominally exceptional as well as the utterly exceptionable. There was a fire at Negro nightclub called the Black Spot in 1930. A year before that, a bunch of half-bright Depression outlaws was gunned down on Canal Street in the middle of the afternoon. The Bradley gang, Bill said. The FBI got them, right? That's what the history says. But that's not precisely true so far as I've been able to find out. And I've give a lot to believe that it wasn't so, because I love this town, the Bradley gang. All 7 of them were actually gunned down by the good citizens of Derry. I'll tell you about it sometime. There was the explosion at the Kitchener Ironworks during an Easter egg hunt in 1906. There was a horrible series of animals mutilations that same year that was finally traced to Andrew Rillian, the grand uncle of the man who now runs the Rillian Farms. He was apparently bludgeoned to death by the 3 deputies who were supposed to bring him in. None of the deputies were ever brought to trial. Mike Hanlon produced a small notebook from an inner pocket and paged through it, talking without looking up. In 1877, there were 4 lynchings inside the incorporated town limits. One of those that climbed a rope was the lay preacher of the Methodist Church, who apparently drowned all 4 of his kids in the bathtub as if they were kittens, and then shot his wife in the head. He put the gun in her hand to make it look like suicide, but no one was fooled. A year before that, 4 loggers were found dead in the cabin downstream on the Kensdrick. Literally tore apart. Disappearance of children, of whole families, are recorded in the old diary extracts, but not in any public document. It goes on and on. Perhaps you get the idea. I get the idea, all right, Ben said. Something's going on here, but it's private. Mike closed his notebook, replaced it in his inner pocket, and looked at them soberly. If I were an insurance man instead of the librarian, I'd draw you a graph maybe. It would show an unusually high rate of every violent crime we know of, not including rape, incest, break-in and enter and auto thief, child abuse, spouse abuse, assault. There's a medium-sized city in Texas where the violent crime rate is far below what you expect for a city of its size and mixed rational makeup. The extraordinary, particularly of the people who live there, has been traced to something in the water, a natural trank of some kind. The exact opposite holds true here. Derry is a violent place to live in the ordinary year, but every 27 years, although the cycle has never been perfectly exact, that violence has accelerated to a furious peak, and has never been national news. You're saying there's a cancer at work here, Beverly said. Not at all. An untreated cancer inevitably kills. Derry hasn't died. On the contrary, it has thrived in an unspectacular, unnewsworthy way, of course. It is simply a fairly pastoral small city in the relative unpopulous state where bad things happen too often and where ferocious things happen every quarter of a century or so. That holds true all down the line, Ben asked. Mike nodded. All down the line, 1715 to 1740 until roughly 1743. That must have been a bad one, 1769 to 70, and on, right up to the present time. I have a feeling that it's been getting steadily worse. Maybe because there have been more people in Derry at the end of each cycle. Maybe for some other reason. And in 1958, the cycle appears to have come to a premature end for which we were responsible. Bill Debrog leaned forward, his eyes suddenly bright. You're sure of that, sure? Yes, Mike said. All the other cycles reached their peak around September and then ended in a big way. Life usually took on its more or less normal terror by Christmas, Easter at latest. In other words, there were bad years of 14 to 20 months every 27 years, but the bad year that began when your brother was killed in October of 1957 ended quite absurdly in August of 1958. Why? Eddie asked urgently. His breath had thinned. Bill remembered that high whistle as Eddie inhaled breath and knew that he would soon be tooted on the old lung sucker. What did we do? The question hung there. Mike seemed to regard it, and at last he shook his head. You'll remember, he said. In time you'll remember. What if we don't? Ben asked. Then God helps us all. 9 children dead this year, Rich said. Christ. Lisa Atras and Stephen Johnson in late 1984, Mike said. In February, a boy named Dennis Torrio disappeared. A high school boy. His body was found in the mid-March in the Barrens, Mulligan. This was nearby. He took a photograph from the same pocket into which he had replaced a notebook. It made its way around the table. Beverly and Eddie looked at it, puzzled, but Richie Tozier reacted violently. He dropped it as if he were hot. Jesus, Mike. He looked up, his eyes wide in shock, and a moment later he passed the picture to Bill. Bill looked at it and felt the words swim into gray tones all around him. For a moment he was sure he would pass out. He heard a groan and knew he had made the sound. He dropped the picture. What is it? He heard Beverly saying. What does it mean, Bill? It's my brother's school picture, Bill said at last. It's Georgie, the picture from his album, the one that moved, the one that winked. They handed it around again. Then while Bill sat us still as stone at the head of the table, looking out into space, it was a photograph of a photograph. The picture showed a tattered school picture photo prop against a white background, smiling lips parted into exhibit 2 holes where new teeth had never grown unless they grow in your coffin. Bill fought and stuttered. On the margin below George's picture were the words, School Friends, 1957 to 58. It was found this year? Beverly asked again. Mike nodded it, and she turned to Bill. When did you last see it, Bill? He wet his lip, tried to speak. Nothing came out. He tried again, hearing the word echo in his head, aware of the stutter. Coming back, fighting the terror. I haven't seen that picture since 1958. That spring, the year after George died. When I tried to show it to Richie, it was gone. There was an explosive gasping sound that made them all look around. Eddie was setting his aspirin back on the table and looking slightly embarrassed. Eddie Kastrick, blast off, Richie cried cheerfully, and then suddenly, eerily, the voice of a movie-tone neutral narrator came from Richie's mouth. Today on Dairy's News, a whole city turns out for Asthmatics on parade. And the star of the show is Big Ed the Snuthead, known all over New England as he stopped abruptly and one hand moved toward his face as if to cover his eyes, and Bill suddenly thought, no, that's not it. Not to cover his eyes, but to push his glasses up on his nose. The glasses that aren't even there anymore. Oh dear Christ, what's going on here? Eddie, I'm sorry, Rich said. That was cruel. I don't know what the hell I was thinking about. He looked around at the other, being wilderly. Mike Hanlon spoke into silence. I'd promised myself after Steven Johnson's body was discovered, that if anything else happened, if there was one more clear case, I would make the calls I ended up not making for another 2 months. It was as if I was hypnotized by what was happened, by the consciousness of it, the derpilnitions of it. George's picture was found by a fallen less than 10 feet from the Toro boy's body. It wasn't hidden, quite the contrary. It was as if the killer wanted it to be found, as I'm sure the killer did. How did you get the police photo, Mike? Ben asked. That's what it is, isn't it? Yes, that's what it is. There's a fellow in the police department who isn't average to make a little extra money. I pay him $20 a month, all that I can afford. He's a pipeline. The body of Don Bone Roy was found 4 days ago after the Toro boy McArron Park, 13 years old, decapitated April 23rd of this year. Adam Tellensolt, 16, reported missing when he didn't come home from band practice, found the next day, just off the path that runs through the green belt behind West Broadway. Also decapitated May 6th, Frederick Cohen, 2.5, found in upstairs bathroom, drowned in the toilet. Oh, Mike, Beverly cried. Yeah, it's bad, he said, almost angrily. Don't you think I know that? The police are convinced that it couldn't have been, some kind of accident, Bev asked. Mike shook his head. His mother was hanging clothes in the backyard. She heard sounds of struggle, heard her son screaming. She ran as fast as she could. As she went up the stairs, she says she heard the sound of the toilet flushing repeatedly, and someone laughing. She said it didn't sound human, and she saw nothing at all. Eddie asked her son, Mike said simply. His back had been broken, his skull fractured. The glass door of the shower stall was broken. There was blood everywhere. The mother is in the Bangor mental health Institute 10. Now, my police department source says she's quite lost her mind. No fucking wonder, Richie said hoarsely. Who's got a cigarette? Beverly gave him one. Rich lit it with hands that shook badly. The police line is the cat killer. Came in through the front door, while the Cohen's boy's mother was hanging her clothes in the backyard. Then, when she ran the back stairs, he supposedly jumped from the bathroom window into the yard. She just left and got away clean, but the window is the only one of those half-sized jobs. A kid of 7 who had to wriggle to get it through it. And the drop was 25 feet to a stone flag patio. Rand Marcher doesn't like to talk about those things, and no one is the press, certainly no one at the news, has pressed him about them. Mike took a drink of water and then passed another picture down the line. This was not a police photograph. It was another school picture. It showed a grim boy who was maybe 13. He was dressed in his best for the school photo, and his hands were clean and folded neatly in his lap. But there was a devilish little glint in his eyes. He was black. Jeffrey Molly, Mike said, May 13, a week after the Cohen boy was killed. Torn open. He was found in Bessie Park by the canal. 9 days after that, May 22nd, a 5th grader named Josh Furman was found dead out on Neobolt Street. Eddie uttered a high, curved scream. He grabbed for his aspiratin and knocked it off the table. It rolled down to Bill, who picked it up. Eddie's face had gone sickish yellow color. His breath whistled coldly in his throat. Get him something to drink, Ben roared. Somebody get him. But Eddie was shaking his head. He triggered the aspirate down his throat. His chest heaved as he tore in a gulp of air. He triggered the aspiratin again and then sat back, eyes half closed, painting. I'll be all right, he gasped. Give me a minute. I'm with you. Eddie, are you sure? Beverly asked. Maybe you ought to lie down. I'll be all right, we repeated cordially. It was just the shock, the shock. I'd forgot all about Neobold Street. No one replied. No one had to. Bill fought. You believe your capability has been reached, and then Mike produced another name, and then yet like a black magician with a hat full of Magdalene tricks, and you're knocked on your ass again. It was too much to face all at once. This outpouring of exemplary violence, somehow directly aimed at the 6 people here, or so George's photograph seemed to suggest. Both of John Furd's legs were gone, Mike continued softly, but the medical examiner says that happened after he died. His heart gave out. He seems to have quite literally died of fear. He was found by the postman, who saw a hand sticking out from under the porch. It was 29, wasn't it? Rich said, and Bill looked at him quickly. Rich glanced back at him, nodded slightly, and then looked at Mike again. 29 Neobold Street. Oh, yes, Mike said in that same calm voice. It was number 29. And drank more water. Are you really all right, Eddie? Eddie nodded. His breathing had eased. Raid Marcher made an arrest the day after Ferrer's body was discovered. Mike said. There was a front-page Ederlin in the news that same day, calling for his register instantly. After 8 murders, Ben said. Pretty radical of them, wouldn't you say? Beverly wanted to know who had been arrested. A guy who lives in a little shack way out on Route 7, almost over the town line, and into the Newport, Mike said. Kind of hermit, burned scrap wood in his stove, roofed the place with scavenger shinnicles and hubcaps. Name of Harold Earl. Probably doesn't see $200 in cash money over the course of a year. Someone driving by saw him standing out in his dooryard, just looking up at the sky on the day John Furrow's body was discovered. His clothes were covered with blood. Then maybe, Rich began hopefully, he had 3 butchered deers in his shed, Mike said. He'd been jacking over in heaven. The blood on his clothes was deer blood. Rand Marcher asked him if he killed John Furrow, and Earl is supposed to have said, I killed a lot of people. I shot most of them in the war. He almost said he'd seen things in the woods at night. Blue lights sometimes floating just a few inches off the ground. Corpse lights, he called them, and Bigfoot. They sent him up to the Bangor mental health, according to the medical report. His liver's almost entirely gone. He's been drinking paint thinner. Oh my God, Beverly said. And is prone to hallucination? They've been holding on to him. And until 3 days ago, Rand Marcher was sticking on his idea that Earl was the most likely suspect. He had 8 guys out there digging around his shack and looking for the missing heads, lampshades made out of human skin. God knows what. Mike paused, head lower, and then went on. His voice was slightly hoarse now. I'd held off, but when I saw this last one, I made the call. I wish to God I'd made some sooner. Let's see, Ben said urbiously. The victim was another 5th grader, Mike said. A classmate of Furrenboy. He was found just off Kensington Street, near where Bill used to hide his bike when we were in the Barrens. His name was Jerry Bellwood. He was torn apart. What was left of him was found at the foot of the cement retaining wall that was put in along most of Kensington Street about 20 years ago to stop the soil. Escherin, this police photograph of the section of that wall where Bellwood was found was taken less than half an hour after the body was removed. Here, he passed a picture of Rich Tozier, who looked and passed it out to Beverly. She glanced at it briefly, winced, and passed it on to Eddie, who gazed at it long and rapidly before handing it on to Ben. Ben passed it to Bill, which barely glanced, printed strangled its way across the concerned retaining wall. It said, "Come home, come home, come home." Bill looked up at Mike grimly. He had been being wilder and frightened. Now he felt the first streamers of anger. He was glad angry was not such a great way to feel, but it was better than the shock better than a mercurial fear. It is that written in what I think it's written in? Yes, Mike said. Jerry Bellwood's blood. 5. Richie gets beat. Mike had taken his photographs back. He had an idea that Bill might ask for the one of Georgie's last school pictures, but Bill did not. He put them in his inside jacket pocket, and when they were out of sight, all of them, Mike included, felt a sense of relief. 9 children, Beverly was saying softly. I can't believe it. I can believe it, but I can't believe it. 9 kids and nothing at all. It's not quite like that, Mike said. People are angry. People are scared. Or so it seems. It's really impossible to tell which ones really feel that way and which ones are faking. Faking? Beverly, do you remember when we were kids? The man who just folded his newspaper and went inside his house while you were screaming for help help? For a moment, something seemed to jump in her eyes, and she looked both terrified and aware. Then she only looked puzzled. No. When was that, Mike? Never mind. It will all come to you in time. All I can say now is that everything looks the way it should be in Derry. Faced with such a grisly sit in murders, people are doing all the things you expect them to do. And most of them are the same things that went on while kids were disappearing and getting murdered back in 58. The Save Our Children committed it is meeting again, only this time at Derry Elementary School. Instead of Derry High, there are 16 detectives from the state Attorney General's office in town, and the committance of FBI agents as well. I don't know how many, and although Rand Marchers talks big, I don't think he does either. The Crufits back in effect. Oh yes, the curfew. Ben was rubbing the side of his neck slowly and turbulently. That did wonders back in 58. I remember that much. And there are Mother's Walker groups to make sure that every child who goes to school, grades K through 8, is chaperoned home. The news has gotten over 2,000 letters demanded a mutation has begun again. I sometimes think that's the only way to really tell who's censoring about wanting it to stop and who isn't. The really censorious is one gets scared and leave. People really are leaving, Richie asked. It happens each time the cycle cranks up again. It's impossible to tell just how many go, because the cycle hasn't fallen squarely in a censorious year since 1850 or so. But it's a fairish number. They run like kids who just found out of the house was haunted for real after all. Come home, come home, come home, Beverly said softly. When she looked up from her hand, it was Bill she looked at, not Mike. It wanted us to come back. Why? It may want us all back, Mike said a little captiously. Sure, it may. It may want revenge. After all, we baked it before. We balked it once before. Revenge or just to set things back in order, Bill said. Mike nodded. Things are out of order. With your own lives, too, you know. None of you left Derry untouched, without its mark on you. All of you forgot what happened here, and your memories of that summer are still only fragmentary. And then there's the passionately curious fact that you're all rich. Oh, come on now, Richie said. That's hardly... Be soft, be soft, Mike said, holding his hand up and smiling faintly. I'm not accusing you of anything, just trying to get the facts out on the table. You are rich by the standards of a small-town librarian who makes just under 11 grand a year after taxes, okay? Rich shrugged the shoulder of his expensive suit uncomfortably. Ben appeared, deeply absorbed in tearing small strips from the edge of his napkin. No one was looking directly at Mike except Bill. None of you are in an H.L. Hunt class, certainly, Mike said. But you are all well-to-do even by the standards of the American upper middle class. We're all friends here, so fess up. There's one of you who declared less than $90,000 on her 1984 tax return. Raise your hand. They glanced around at each other, almost furiously embarrassed, as Americans always seem to be by the raw fact of their own success, as if cash were hard cooked eggs, and awfulest the farts that inevitably follow on overdose of same. Bill felt hot blood on his cheek and was helpless. to stop its rise. He had been paid 10,000 more than the sum Mike had mentioned just for doing the first draft on the Attic Room screenplay. He had been promised an additional $20,000 each for 2 rewrites if needed. Then there were royalties and then hefty advance on a 2-book contract just signed. How much bad he declare on his 84 tax return? Just about $800,000, right? Enough anyway to seem almost monstrosity in light of Mike Hanlon's started income of just under $11,000 a year. So that's how much they paid you to keep the lighthouse. Mike, old kid, Bill thought. Jesus Christ, somewhere along the line, you should have asked for a raise. Mike said Bill Debrog, a successful novelist in a society where there are only a few novelists, and fewer still lucky enough to be making a living room from the crowd. Beverly Rogan, who's in a rag trade, a field to which more are called, but even fewer chosen. She is, in fact, the most sought-after designer in the middle third of the country right now. Oh, it's not me, Beverly said. She uttered a nervous little laugh, and it lit a fresh cigarette from the smoldering stub of the old one. It's Tom. Tom's the one. Without him, I'd still be reeling skirts and sewing up hems. I don't have any business sense at all. Even Tom says so. It's just, Tom and luck. She took a single deep drag from her cigarette and then snuffled it. Methinks the lady doth protest too much, Richie said silent. She turned quickly in her seat and gave him a hard look, her colored high. Just what's that supposed to mean, Richie Tozier? Don't hits me, Ms. Scarlett, Richie cried in a high, trembling, pickaninny voice. And in that moment, Bill could see without an eerie clarity the boy he had known. He was not just a person's lurking under Rich Tozier's grown-up exterminator, but a creature almost more real than the man himself. Don't hits me. Let me bring you another mint julep, Ms. Scarlett. Yo's gon' drink hit out on deep hoach, where it's been a little bit coolin'. Don't wimp desire, boy. You're impossible, Richie, Beverly said coldly. You out to grow up. Richie looked at her, his grin fading slowly into uncertainty. Until I came back here, he said. He out I had. Rich, you may just be the most successful disc jockey in the United States, Mike said. You certainly got L.A. in palm of your hand. On top of that, there are 2 segments programs. One of them, a straight top 40 countdown, showed the other one, something called the Freaky 40. You better watch out, fool, Richie said in a guff Mr. T voice. But he was blushing. I'll make your front and back change places. I'll give you brain surgery with my fist. Eddie, Mike went on, ignoring Richie. You got a healthy limo service in a city where you are just about have to elbow long black cars out of your way when you're across the street. 2 limo companies of week ago, smashing a big apple, but you're doing fine. Ben, you're probably the most successful young accident in the world. Ben opened his mouth, probably to protest, and then closed it again obdurately. Mike smiled at them, spread his hands. I don't want to embarrass anyone, but I do want all the cards on the table. There are people who succeed young, and there are people who succeed in highly specialized jobs. If there weren't people who buck the odds successfully, I guess everybody who'd give up if it was just 1 or 2 of you. We could pass it off as conditions, but it's not just 1 or 2. It's all of you, and that includes Stan Uris, who was the most successful young encounter in Atlanta, which means in the whole South. My conclusion is that your success stems from what happened here 27 years ago. If you had all been exposed to absinthe at that time, you and all developed lung cancer by now. The correlate would be no less clear or persuasive. Do any of you want to dispute it? He looked at them. No one answered. All except you, Bill said. What happened to you, Mikey? Isn't it obvious? He grinned. I stayed here. You kept the lighthouse, Ben said. Bill jerked around and looked at him, startled. But Ben was staring hard at Mike and didn't see. That doesn't make me feel so good, Mike, in fact. It makes me feel sort of like bug turd. Amen, Beverly said. Mike shook his head patiently. You have nothing to feel guilty about, any of you. Do you think it was my choice to stay here any more than it was your choice, any of you, to leave? Hell, we were kids. For one reason or another, your parents moved away, and you guys were part of the Babbage they took along. My parents stayed, and it wasn't really their decision, any of them. I don't think so. How was it decide who would go and who would stay? Was it luck, free, fate it, some other? I don't know, but it wasn't us, guys, so quit it. You're not bitter, Eddie asked timidly. It's been too busy to be bitter, Mike said. I've been spent a long time watching and waiting. I was watching and waiting even before I knew it. I think but for the last 5 years, so I've been on what you might call red alert. Since the turn of your year, I've been keeping a journal, and when a man writes, he thinks harder, or maybe just more suspiciously. And one of the things I'd spent time writing thinking about is it the nature of it. It changes. We know that. I think it also manipulates and leaves its marks on people just by the nature of what it is. The way you can smell a skunk on you even after a long bath if it lets go its bag of scents too near you. The way a grasshopper will split bug juice into your palm if you catch it in your hand. Mike slowed unbuttoned his shirt and spread it wide. They could all see the pickage scrawls of scars across the smooth brown skin of his chest between the nipples. The way claws leave scars, he said. The werewolf, Richie almost moaned. Oh, Christ, Big Bill, the werewolf. When we went back to Neobold Street. What, Bill asked. He sounded like a man called out of a dream. What, Richie? Don't you remember? No. Do you? I almost do. Looking both confused and scared. Richie suppens. Are you saying this thing isn't evil? Eddie asked Mike absurdly. He was staring at the scars as if he was hypnotized. It's just some part of the natural order. It's no part of a natural order. We understand, or condone, Mike said, rebuttoning his shirt. And I see no reason to operate on my other basins than to one we do understand. That it kills children, and that's wrong. Bill understood that before any of us. Do you remember, Bill? I remember that I wanted to kill it, Bill said, and for the first time and ever after, he heard the pronoun gain proper noun statements in his own voice. But I didn't have much of a world view on the subject, if you see what I mean. I just wanted to kill it because it killed Georgie. And do you still? Bill considered this carefully. He looked down at his spread hands on the table and remembered George in his yellow slicker, his hood up, the paper boat with its thin glaze on Pafferin in one hand. He looked up at Mike. More than ever, he said. Mike nodded it, as if there were exactly what he had expected it. It left its mark on us. It worked its will on us, just as it had worked its will on this whole town. Day in and day out, even during those long periods when it is asleep or hibernated or whatever it does between its more live-in periods. Mike raised one finger. But if it works its will on us at some point, it's some way. We also worked our will on it. We stopped it before it was done. I know we did. Did we weaken it? Hurt it? Did we in fact almost kill it? I think we did. I think we came so close to killing it that we went away thinking we had. But you don't remember that part either, do you? Ben asked. No, I can remember everything up until August 15, 1958, with almost perfect clarity. But from then until September 4th or so, when school was called in again, everything is in total blank. It isn't murky or hazy. It is just completely gone with one exception. I see to remember Bill screaming about something called the deadlights. Bill's arm jerked convulsively and struck one of his empty beer bottles, and the bottle shattered on the floor like a bomb. Did you cut yourself? Beverly asked. She had half risen. No, he said. His voice was harsh and dry. His arm had broken on a goose flesh. It seemed that his skull had somehow grown. He could feel. the deadlights, it pressing out against the stretched skin on his face in steady, nubbin throbs. I'll pick up the... No, just sit down. He wanted to look at her and couldn't. He couldn't take his eyes off Mike. Do you remember the deadlights, Bill? Mike asked softly. No, he said. His mouth felt the way it did when the dentist got a little too exonerated with the Novocaine. You will. I hope to God I don't. You will anyway, Mike said. But for now, no, not me, either. Do any of you? One by one, they shook their heads. But we did something, Mike said quietly. At some point, we were able to exercise some sort of group will. At some point, we achieved some special understanding, whatever consciousness or unconsciousness. He stirred restlessly. God, I wish Stan was here. I have a feeling that Stan, with his ordered mind, might have had some idea. Maybe he did, Beverly said. Maybe that's why he killed himself. Maybe he understood that if there was magic, it wouldn't work for grown-ups. I think it could, Mike said, because there's one other thing we 6 have in common. I wonder if any of you have realized what that is. It was Bill's turn to open his mouth and then shut it again. Go on, Mike said. You know what it is. I can see it on your face. I'm not sure I know, Bill replied, but I think we're all childless. Is that it? There was a moment of shocked silence. Yeah, Mike said, that's it. Jesus Christ almighty, Eddie spoke up intentionally. What in the world does that have to do with the price of beans and Peru? What gave you the idea that everyone in the world has to have kids? That's nuts. Do you have your wife have children? Do you and your wife have children? Mike asked. If you've been keeping track of us all the way, you said, then you know goddamn well we don't. But I still say it doesn't mean a damn thing. Have you tried to have children? We don't use birth controls, if that's what you mean, Eddie spoke with an oddly moving dignity, but his cheeks were flushed. It's just so happened that my wife is a little, oh hell, she's a lot overweight. We went to see a doctor, and she told us my wife might never have kids if she didn't lose some weight. Does that make us criminals? Make it easy, Eds, Richie smoothed and leaned toward him. Don't call me Eds, and you don't dare pinch my cheek, he cried, rounding on Richie. You know I hate that. I always hated that. Richie recalled blinking. Beverly, Mike asked, what about you and Tom? No children, she said. Also no birth control. Tom wants kids. And so do I, of course, she added hastily, glancing around at them. Bill thought her eyes seemed overbright, almost the eyes of an actress given a good performance. It just hasn't happened yet. Have you had those tests? Ben asked her. Oh, yes, of course, she said, and uttered a light laugh that was almost a titter, and in one of those leaps of compressions that sometimes come to people who are gifted with both curiosity and insight. Bill suddenly understood a great deal about Beverly and her husband, Tom Elysius, the greatest man in the world. Beverly had gone to have firstly tested. His guess was that the greatest man in the world had refused to entertain even for a moment the notion that there might be something wrong with the sperm being manufactured in the scared sacks. What about you and your wife, Big Bill? Rich asked. Been trying? They all looked at him curiously, because his wife was something they knew. Audrey was by no means the best known for the best-loved actress in the world, but she was certainly part of the celebrity collections that had somehow replaced that talent as a medium of exchange. In the letter, half on the 20th century, there had been a picture of her in People magazines when she cut her hair short, and during a particular boring stretch in New York, the play she had been planning to off-Broadway fell through. She had done a week-long sting on Hollywood Squares over her agent Samesh's objections. She was a stranger whose lovely face was known to them. He thought Beverly looked particularly curious. We've been trying off and on for the last 6 years, Bill said. For the last 8 months or so, it's been off because of the movie we were doing, Attic Room, it's called. You know, we run a little entertainment signings every day from 5:15 in the afternoon until 5:30, Richie said. Seeing Stars, it's called. They had a feature on that damn movie just last week. Husband and wife working happily together, kind of thing. They said both of your names, and I never made the connection. Funny, isn't it? Very, Bill said. Anyway, Audrey said it would be just our luck if she caught pregnant while we were in pre-production and she had to do 10 weeks of Cendrill's acted and being morning sick at the same time. But we weren't kids, yes, and we tried quite hard. Had ferociously tests. Ben asked, 4 years ago. In New York, the doctors discovered a very small began tumor in Audrey's womb. And they say it was a lucky thing because although it wouldn't have prevented her from getting pregnant, it might have caused a tumble pregnancy. She and I are both firmly through. Eddie repeated stubbornly, it doesn't prove a goddamn thing. Suggested through, Ben murmured. No, a little accidents on your front, Ben? Bill asked. He was shocked and amused to find that his mouth had very nearly called Ben Haystack. Instead, I've never been married. I've always been careful, and there have no patrician suits, Ben said. Beyond that, I don't think there's any real way of telling. You want to hear a funny story, Richie asked. He was smiling, but there was no smile in his eyes. Sure, Bill said. You were always good at the funny stuff, Richie. Your face and me own butt talks, boyo, Richie said in an Irish cop's voice. It was a great Irish cop's voice. You've impropped out of all measures, Richie, Bill thought. As a kid, you couldn't do an Irish cop, no matter, but you bursted your brains except one or twice. When the deadlights, was that your face and me own butt talks? Just keep remember it. That come imprisonment, me foil bucko. Ben Hanscom suddenly held his nose and cried in a high, quiverish, boyish voice. Beep, beep, Richie. Beep, beep, beep. After a moment of laughter, Eddie held his own nose and joined in. Beverly did the same. All right, Richie cried, laughing at himself. All right, I give up. Christ's sake. Oh, man, Eddie said. He collapsed back in his chair, laughing so hard he was almost crying. We got you that time, trash mouth. Way to go, Ben. Ben was smiling, but he looked a little bemuddled. Beep, beep, Bev said and giggled. I forgot all about that. We used to say that. We used to beep you, Richie. You guys never appreciated true talent. That's all, Richie said comfortedly. As in the old days, you could knock him off the balance, but he was like one of those inflatable Joe Pookaloo dolls with sand in the base. He floated upright again almost at once. That was one of your little combination to the Losers Club, wasn't it, Haystack? Yeah, I guess it was. What a man, Richie said in a trembling A-stock voice, and then began to slam over the table, nearly sticking his nose in his teacup each time he went down. What a man, oh Chilliam, what a man. Beep, beep, Richie, Ben said sonantly, and then exploded laughter in a hearted baritone, utterly unlike his wavery childhood voice. You're the same old road runner. You guys want to hear this story or not? Richie asked. I mean, no big deal one way or another. Beep anyway if you want to. I can take abuse. I mean, you're looking at a man who once did an interview with Ozzy Osbourne. Tell it, Bill said. He glanced over at Mike and saw that Mike looked happier, or more at rest, since the luncheon had begun. Wasn't it because he saw the almost concussion knitting together that was happening? The sort of easy falling back into old rows that almost never happened when old chums got together. Bill thought so. And then he thought, if there are certain concussions for the believes in magic that makes it possible to use the magic, then maybe those persociations will intervene and arrange themselves. It was not a very comforting thought. It made him feel like a man strapped to the nose cone of a gliding missile. Beep, beep, indeed. Well, Richie was saying, I could make this long and sad, or I could give you the Blondin and Dogwood comic strip version, but I'll settle for something in the middle. The year after I moved out to California, I met a girl, and we fell pretty hard, or each time, standard living together. She was on the pill at first, but it made her feel sick almost all at the same time. She talked about getting an IUD, but I wasn't too crazy about that. The first stories about how they might not be completely safe were just starting to come out in the papers. We had talking a lot about kids and had pretty well decided we didn't want them even when if he decided to legally the relationships are responsible to bring kids into such a shitty, dangerous, over postulated world. And blah blah blah, blabble blabble blabble. Let's go out and put a bomb in men's room of the Bank of America and then come on back to the crash pad and smoke some dope and talk about the difference between museum and trichonosum, if you see what I mean. Or maybe I'm being too hard on both of us. Shit, we were young and reasonably identilogic. The upshot was that I got my wires cut, as the Beverly Hills crowd puts it, with their unfailing virtually jerks. The operation went with no problem, and I had no observed after effects. There can be, you know. I had a friend whose balls swelled up to roughly the size of the tire on a 1959 Cadillac. It was gonna give me a pair of suspenders and a couple of barrels of his birthday, sort of designer trust, but they went down before them. All put with the customer's tact and dignity. Bill remarked, and Beverly began to laugh again. Richie offered a large, sensual smile. Thank you, Bill, for those words of support. The word fuck was used 206 times in your last book. I counted it. Beep, beep, trash mouth, Bill said solemnly. Then all laughed. Bill thought it nearly impossible to believe they had been talking about dead children less than 10 minutes ago. Press outward, Richie, Ben said. The hour growth late. Sandy and I lived together for 2.5 years. Richie went on. Came really close to getting married twice, as things turned out, I guess. We saved ourselves a lot heartaches, and all community and property bullshit by keeping it simple. She got an offer to join a corporate law firm in Washington around the same time. I got an offer to come to CLAD as a weekend jock. Not much, but a foot in the door. She told me it was her chance, and I had to be the most insidious male, convicious oinker in the United States to be dragged in my feet. And furthermore, she had it with California anyway. I told her I also had a chance. So we trashed it out, and we trashed each other out. And at the end of it all, the trashing Sandy went. About a year after that, I decided to try and get vasectomy reversed. No real reason for it, and I knew from the stuff I'd read that the chances were pretty spotty. But I thought, what the hell? You were seeing something steadily then, Bill asked. No, that's the funny part of it, Richie said, frowning. I just woke up one day with this hobby horse about getting it reversed. You must have been nuts, Eddie said. General appendix instead of a local surgery. Maybe a week in the hospital afterwards. Yeah, the doctor told me all of that stuff, Richie replied, and I told him I wanted to go ahead anyway. I don't know why. The doc asked me if I understood the aftermath of the operation was sure to be painful, while the results was only going to be coin-tossed at best. I said I did. He said okay, and I asked him when my attitude being the sooner the better, you know. So he says, hold your horses, son, hold your horses. The first step is to get the sperm sample, just to make sure the reversal operation is necessary. I said, come on. I had the exam after the vacancy coming in. It worked. He told me that sometimes the vasa reconnected spiritually. Yo, mama, I says, nobody ever told me that. He said the chances were very small and fortunable, really, but because the operation was so serious, he had to check it out. So I popped into the men's room with a Fredericks of Hollywood caticle and jerked off into a Dixie cup. Beep, beep, Richie, Beverly said. You're right, Richie said. The part about the Frederick catalog is a lie. You never find anything that good in a doctor's office anyway. The doc called me 3 days later and asked me which I wanted it first, the good news or the bad news. Give me the good news first, I said. The good news is the operation won't be necessary, he said. The bad news is that anybody you've been to bed with over the last 2 or 3 years would hit you with a permanency suit pretty much at will. Are you saying what I think you're saying? I asked him. I'm telling you what you want. They aren't shooting blanks and haven't been for quite a while now. He said millions of little wiggles in your sperm sample. Your days of going gaily and bareback with no questions asked have temporarily come to an end, Richard. I thanked him and hugged him. Then I called Sandy in Washington. Rich, she says to me, and Rich's voice suddenly become the voice of this girl, Sandy, one none of them had ever met. It was not an invitation or even a likeness. Exactly. It was more like an auditorium painting. It's great to hear from you. I got married. Yeah, that's great, I said. You should have let me know. I would have sent you a blender. She goes, same old Richie, always full of gags. So I said, sure, same old Richie, always full of gags. By the way, Sandy, you didn't happen to have a kid or anything after you left L.A., did you? Or maybe an unscheduled DNC or something? That gag isn't so funny, Rich, she said, and I had a brain wave that she was getting ready to hang up on me. So I told her what happened. She started laughing, only this time it was real hard. She was laughing the way I always used to laugh with you guys, like somebody had told her the world's biggest belly buster. So when she finally starts slowing down, I asked her what in God's name is funny. It's just so wonderful, she said. This time the joke's on you. After all these years, the joke is finally on Records Tozier. How many bastards have you sired since I came east, Rich? I take it that means you haven't still experienced the joys of motherhood, I asked her. I did in July, she says. Were there any more questions? Yeah, I go. When did you change your mind about the immorality of bringing children into such a shitty world? When I finally met a man who wasn't a shit, she answers and hangs up. Bill began to laugh. He laughed until tears rolled down his cheek. Yeah, Richie said. I think she cut it off quick so she'd really get the last words, but she could have hung on the line all day. I know when I'd been aced, I went back to the doctor a week later and asked him if he could be a little clearer on the odds against the sort of personal recognition. He said he'd talk with some of his collegians about the matter. It turned out that in the 3-year period, 1980-82, the California branch of the AMN logged 23 reports of spurious regentions. 6 of those turned out to be simply botched operations. 6 others were Eider Hawkses on cons guys looking to take a bite out of some doctor bank account. So 11 real ones in 3 years. 11 out of how many, Beverly asked. 28,618, and she calmly. Silence around the table. So I went and beat Irish sweepstakes odds, Richie said, and still no kid to show it for it. That gave you any good chucks, Eds? Eddie began stubbornly. It still doesn't prove. No, Bill said. It doesn't prove of a thing, but it certainly suggests there's a link. The question is, what do we do now? Have you thought about that, Mike? I thought about it, sure, Mike said, but it was impossible to decide anything until you all got together again and talked, the way you've been doing. There was no way I could proceed how this reunion would go until it actually happened. He paused for a long time, looking thoughtfully at them. I got one idea, he said, but before I tell you, what is it? I think we have to agree on whatever or not we have business to do here. Do we want to try again, or do we want we tried to do once before? Do we want to try and kill it again, or do we just divide the check up 6 ways and go back to what we were doing? It seems as if Beverly began, but Mike shook his head at her. He wasn't done. You have to understand, but our chances of success are impossible to predict. I know they're not good, just as I know they would have been a little better if Stan was here, too. Still not real good, but better. With Stan gone, the circle we made that day is broken. I don't really think we can destroy it, or even send it away for a little while, as we did before. With a broken circle, I think it will kill us, one by one, and probably in some extremely horrible ways. As children, we made a complete circle in some way. I don't understand even now. I think that if we agree to go ahead, we'll have to try to form a small circle, or I don't know if we can be done. I believe it might be possible to think we done it only to discover when it was too late. Well, that was too late. Mike regarded them again, eyes sunken and tried to his brown face. So I think we need to take a vote. Stay and try it again, or go home. Those are the choices. I got you here on the strength of an old promise. I wasn't even sure you remember, but I can't hold you here on the strength of that promise. The results of that would be worse and more of it. He looked at Bill, and at that moment, Bill understood that was coming. He dreaded it, was helpless to stop it, and then with the same feeling of relief he imagined must come to a suicide when he takes his hand off the wheel of the speeding car and simply used him to cover his eyes, he accepted it. Mike had gotten them here. Mike had laid it out all neatly out for them. And now he was religious to mantle of leadership. He intended that mantle to go back to the prison who had worn it in 1958. What do you say, Big Bill? Call the question. Before I do, Bill said. Does everyone understand the question? You were going to say something, Bev. She shook her head. All right, I guess the question is, do we stay and fight, or do we forget the whole thing? Those in favors of staying. No one at the table moved at all for perhaps 5 seconds. And Bill was reminded of auction he had attended, where the price of an item suddenly soared into the sepulchre, and those who didn't want to bend anymore almost literally played statues. One was afraid to scratch an itch or wave a fly off the end of one's nose for fear the extortioner would take it for another $5,000 or 25. Bill thought of Georgie, who had meant no any harm, who had only wanted to get out of the house after being cooped up all week. Georgie, with his collar high, his newspaper bow in one hand, snapping the buckles of his yellow rain slicker with the other, Georgie thanking him, and then bended over and kissed his Bill's fever-heated cheek. Thanks, Bill. It's a neat boat. And felt the old rage rise in him. But he was older now, and his persistence was wider. It wasn't just Georgie now. A horrid slew of names marched through his head. Betty Ripson, found frozen to the ground. Cheryl Luckerman, fished down the Kensduck's egg. Matthew Chellemans, torn from his tricycle. Veronica Grogan, 9 years old, and found in the sewer. Stephen Johnson, Liza Appleton, all the others, and God only knew how many of them were missing. He raised his hand slowly and said, "Let's kill it. This time, let's really kill it." For a moment, his hand hung there alone, like the hand of the only kid in the class who knows the right answer, the one all the other kids hate. Then Richie sighed, raised his own hand, and said, "What the hell? It can't be any worse than interviewing Ozzy Osbourne." Beverly raised her hand. Her color was back now, but in Hendrick patches that flare along her cheekbones. She looked both tremulous, excited, and scared to death. Mike raised his hand. Ben raised his. Eddie Kasprak sat back in his chair, looking as if he wished he could actually melt into it and disappear. His face, thin and delicate looking, was miserably afraid as he looked first night and then then back to Bill. For a moment, Bill felt sure Eddie was simply going to push back his chair, rise and bolt from the room without looking back. Then he raised one hand in the arm and grasped his aspirin tightly in the other. "Way to go, Ed," Richie said. "We're really going to have ourselves some chucks this time, I bet." "Beep, beep, Richie," Eddie said in a wavery voice. 6. The losers get dessert. Like Bill asked, the mood had been broken by Rose, the hostess, who had come in with a dish of fortune cookies. She looked around at the 6 people who had their hands in the air with a careful, polite lack of curiosity. They lowered them hastily, and no one said anything until Rose was gone again. "It's simple enough," Mike said, "but it might be pretty damn dangerous, too." "Spill it," Richie said. "I think we ought to split it for the rest of the day. I think each of us ought to go back in the place in Derry he or she remembers best outside in Barron's. That is, I don't think any of us should go there. Not yet. Think of it as a series of walking tours, if you like." "What's the purpose, Mike?" Ben asked. "It's not entirely sure. You have to understand that I'm going pretty much on internet here. But this has a good beat, and you can dance to it," Richie said. The others smiled. Mike did not. He nodded instead. "That's as a good way of putting it as any. Going on intonation is like picking up a beat and dancing to it. Using intonation is a hard thing for grown-ups to do. And that's the main reason I think it might be the right thing for us to do. Kids, after all, operate on it about 80% of the time, at least not until they're 14 or so. You're thinking about plugging back into the situation, Eddie said. I suppose so. Anyway, that's my idea. If no specific place to go comes to you, just follow your feet and see they take you. Then we meet tonight at the library and talk over what happened. If anything happens, Ben said. Oh, I think things will. What sort of things? Bill asked. Mike shook his head. I have no idea. I think whatever happens has happened to be unpleasant. I think it's even possible that one of us may not turn up at the library tonight. No reason for thinking that except that intercession thing again. Silence greeting this. Why alone? Beverly asked finally. If we're supposed to do this as a group, why do you want to start alone, Mike, especially if the risks really turn out to be as high as you think it might be? I think I can answer that, Bill said. Go ahead, Bill, Mike said. It started alone for each of us, Bill said to Beverly. I don't remember everything, not yet, but I'm sure I remember that much. The picture in George's room that moved. Ben's mummy, the leopard that Eddie saw under the porch on Neobold Street, Mike finding the blood on the grass near the canal in Bassey Park, and the bird there was something about a bird, wasn't there, Mike? Mike nodded grimly. A big bird, yes, but not as friendly as the one on Sesame Street. Richie cracked wildly. Derry's answer to James Brown gets off a good one. Oh, Cholem, is we blessed or is we blessed? Beep, beep, Richie, Mike said, and Richie suspended. For you, it was the voice from the pipe and the blood that came out of the drain, Bill said to Beverly, and for Richie. But here he paused, puzzled. As I must be the expression that proves the rule, Big Bill, Richie said. The first time I came in contact with anything that summer, that was weird. I really big leech weird, was in George's room with you. When you and I went back to your house that day and looked at his photo album, the picture of the center by the canal started to move. Do you remember? Yes, Bill said. But are you sure there was nothing before that, Richie? Nothing at all. Something flickered in Richie's eyes. He said slowly, well, there was the day Henry and his friends chased me before the end of school. This was, and I got away from them in the toy department of Friesens. I went up by City Center and sat down on the park bench. And for a while, and I thought I saw, but that was just something I dreamed. What was it? Beverly asked. Nothing, Richie said, almost breathlessly. A dream, really. He looked at Mike. I don't mind taking a walk through. I'll kill the afternoon. Views of the old homestead. So we've agreed? Bill asked. They nodded in. And we'll meet at the library tonight. When do you suggest, Mike? 7 o'clock. Ring the bell if you're late. The lib closes at 7 on weekdays until summer vacation starts for the kids. 7 it is, Bill said. Let his eyes range soberly over them and be careful. You want to remember that none of us really knows what we're doing. Think of this as representation, if you could. See something. Don't fight. Run. I'm a lover, not a fighter, Richie said in a dream of me Michael Jackson voice. Well, if we're going to do it, we ought to get going, Ben said. A small smile put up the left corner of his mouth. It was more bitter than amused. Although I'll be damned if I could tell you right this minute where I'm going to go. If the Barons are out, that was the best of it for me. Going down there with you guys. His eyes moved to Beverly. Held there for a moment, moved away. I can't think of any place else that means very much to me. Probably I'll just wander around for a couple of hours, looking at buildings and getting wet feet. You'll find a place to go, Haystack, Richie said. Visit some of your old footsteps and gas up. Ben laughed. My capity's gone down a lot since I was 11. I was so full of guys. You guys may just have to roll me out of here. Well, I'm all set, Eddie said. Wait a second, Beverly cried as they began to push back from their chairs. The fortune cookies, don't forget those. Yeah, Richie said. I can see mine now. You will soon be eaten up by a large monster. Have a nice day. They laughed and Mike passed a little bowl of fortune cookies to Richie, who took one and then sent it on around the table. Bill noticed that no one opened his or her cookie until each had one. They had sat the little hat-shaped cookies either in front of them or held in their hands. And even as Beverly, still smiling, picks hers up, Bill felt a cry rising in his throat. No, don't do that. It's part of it. Put it down. Don't open it. But it was too late. Beverly had broken hers open. Ben was doing the same to his. Eddie was cut into his whiff, the edge of his fork, and just Beverly's smile turned to a grimace of horror. Bill said, had time to think. We knew something we knew, because no one simply bit into his or her fortune cookie. That would have been the normal thing to do, but no one did it. Somehow, some part of us still remembers everything, and he found that instant under knowledge. Somehow, the most horrifying realization of all, it spoke more incredible than Mike could have about how surely and deeply it had touched each one of them, and how its touched was until upon them blood sputtered from Beverly's fortune cookie, as if from a slash artery. It splashed across her hand and then gouted onto the white napery which covered the table, staining it a bright red that sank in and then spread out in gasping pink fingers. Eddie Kasprak uttered a strangled cry and pushed himself away from the table with such a sudden, revolting confusion of arms and legs that his chair nearly tipped over. A huge bug, its criminous carapace, an ugly yellow-brown, was pushing its way out of the fortune cookie, as if from a cocoon. Its obsession eyes started blinded forward as it lurched onto Eddie's bread and butter plate. Cookie crumbs fell from its back into a little shower that Bill heard clearly and which came back to haunt his dreams. When he slept for a while later that afternoon, as it freed itself entirely, it rubbed its thin rear legs together, producing a dry reed hum. And Bill realized it was some sort of terrible muttering cricket. It lumbered to the edge of the dish and trembled onto the tablecloth on its back. "Oh, God," Richie managed in a choked voice. "Oh, my God, Big Bill, it's an eye. Dear God, it's a eye. A fucking eye." Bill's head snapped around, and he saw Richie staring down at his fortune cookie. His lips draw back from his teeth in a kind of sickened leer. A chunk of his cookie's glazed surface had fallen onto the tablecloth, revealing a hole from which a human eyeball started with glance intensity. Cookie crumbs were scattering across its blank brown iris and indented in its scaleron. Van Hanscom threw his, not a calculated throw, but the startled reaction of a person who has been utterly surprised by some piece of nasty work. From his fortune cookie rolled across the table, Bill saw 2 teeth inside. It's hollow, their roots dark with clotted blood. They rattled together like seeds in a hollow groan. He looked back at Beverly and saw she was hitching in breath to scream. Her eyes were fixed on the thing that had crawled out of Eddie's cookie, the thing that was now kicking its sludging legs as it was laid overturned on the tablecloth. Bill got moving. He was not thinking, only reacting. In imitation, he fought crazily as he lugged out of his seat and clapped his hands over Beverly's mouth just before she could utter the scream. "Here I am, acting on audition. Mike should be proud of me." What came out of Beverly's mouth was not a scream, but a strangled mimic. Eddie was making those whistling sounds that Bill remembered so well. No problem there, a good honk on the old lung sucker would set Eddie right on as Freddie Firestone would have said, and Bill wondered, not for the first time, why a person had such weird thoughts at times like these. He glanced around furiously at the others, and what came out was something else from that summer, something that sounded both impossibly arctic and exactly right. "Dummy up, all of you. Not one sound, just dummy up." Rich wide a hand across his mouth. Mike's complexion had gone a dirty gray, but he nodded at Bill. All of them moved away from the table. Bill had not opened his fortune cookie, but now he could see its side, moving slowly in and out, bulged and relaxed, bulged and relaxed, bulged and relaxed, as his own party favor tried to escape. Beverly said against his hand again, her breath tickling his palm. "Dummy up, Bev," he said, and took his hand away. Her face seemed to be all eyes. Her mouth twitched. Bill, do you see?" Her eyes strayed back to the cricket and then fixed there. The cricket appeared to be dying. Its rugose eyes stared back at her, and presently Beverly began to moan. "Quit that," he said grimly. "Pull back to the table." "I can't, Billy. I can't get near that fig." "You can. You have to." He heard footsteps, light and quick, coming up the short hall on the other side of the beaded curtains. He looked around at the others. "All of you, pull up to the table. Talk, look natural." Beverly looked at him, eyes pleading, and Bill shook his head. He sat down and pulled his chair, and trying not to look at the fortune cookie on his plate, and he had swelled like some unmanageable boil which was filling with pus, and still it pulsed slowly in and out. I could have bitten into that, he thought faintfully. Eddie triggered his aspirate down his throat again, gasping mist into his lung in a long, thin, screaming sound. So, who do you think's going to win the pediment? Bill asked. Mike smiled instantly. Rose came through the curtains just then, her face politely questioning. Out of the corner of his eyes, Bill saw that Bev had pulled up to the table again. Good girl, he thought. I think the Chicago Bears look good, Mike said. Everything is all right, Rose asked. Fine, Bill said. He cocked his thumb in Eddie's direction. Our friend had an asthma attack. He took his medication. He's better now. Rose looked at Eddie concerned. Better, Eddie wheezed. You would look like that eye clear now. Very shortly, Mike said, and offered a large, false smile. Was good. Her eyes surveyed the table again, a bit of doubt overlaying of deep, well-certain. She did not see the cricket, the eye, the teeth, or the way Bill's fortune cookie appeared to be breathing. Her eyes similarly passed over the bloodstain splotched on the table, clothed about trouble. Everything was very good, Beverly said, and smiled a more natural smile than either Bill's or Mike's. It seems to set Rose's mind at rest, convinced her that if something had gone wrong in here, it had been the fault of neither Rose's service nor her kitchen. Girls got a lot of guts, Bill thought. Fortunes were good, Rose asked. Well, Richie said, I don't know about the others, but I, for one, got a real eyeful. Bill heard a minute cracking a sound. He looked down at his plate, and he saw a leg poking blindly out of his fortune cookie. It scraped at his plate. I could have bitten into that, he thought again. But held onto his smile. Very fine, he said. Richie was looking at Bill's plate. A great grayish-black fly was slowly birthing itself from the collapsing remains of his cookie. It buzzed weakly. Yellowish goo flowed sluggishly out of the cookie and puddled on the tablecloth. There was a smell now, the bland, thick smell of an infected wound. Well, if I can help you in no way at this moment. Not right now, Ben said. A wonderful meal, most unusual. I leave you then, she said, and bowed out through the beaded curtain. Then beads were still swaying and cackling together when all of them pushed away from the table. What is it? Ben asked huskily, looking at the thing on Bill's plate. A fly, Bill said. A mutated fly, coordination of a writer named George Langnahan. I think he wrote a story called The Fly. A movie was made out of it. It's not a terrible good one, but the story scared the bee juice out of me. It's up on its old tricks, all right. That fly business has been on my mind a lot lately because I've sort of been playing this novel, Road Bugs. I've been thinking of calling it. I know the title sounds pretty stupid, but you see, excuse me, Beverly said distantly. I have to vomit, I think. She was gone before any of the men could rise. Bill shook out of his napkin and threw it over the fly, which was the size of a baby sprout. Nothing so large could have come from something as small as a Chinese fortune cookie, but it had. It buzzed twice under the napkin and then fell silent. Jesus, Eddie said faintly. Let's get the righteous fuck out of here, Mike said. We can meet Bev in the lobby. Beverly was just coming out of the woman's room as they gathered by the cash register. She looked pale but composed. Mike's made the check, kissed Rose's cheek, and then they all went out into the rainy afternoon. Does this change anyone's mind? Mike said. I don't think it changes minds, Ben said. No, Eddie said. What mind? Richie said. But Bill shook his head and then looked at Beverly. I'm staying, she said. Bill, what did you mean when you said it's up to its old tricks? I've been thinking about writing a bug story, he said. That Lanaga story had woven itself into my thinking, and so I saw a fly. Yours was blood, Beverly. Why was blood on your mind? I guess because of the blood from the drain, Beverly said at once. The blood that came out of the bathroom drain in the old place when I was 11. But was that really it? She didn't really think so, because what had flashed immediately to mind when the blood spurted across her fingers in a warm little jet had been the bloody footprint she had left behind her after stepping on the broken perfume bottle. Tom and Bevy, sometimes I worry a lot, her father. You got a bug too, Bill said to Eddie. Why? Not just a bug, Eddie said. A cricket. There are crickets in our basement, $200,000 house, and we can't get rid of the crickets. They drive us crazy at night. A couple of nights before, Mike called. I had a really terrible nightmare. I dreamed. I woke up and my bed was full of crickets. I was trying to shoot them with my aspirin, but all it would do when I squeezed it was making crackling noises. And just before I woke up, I realized it was full of crickets, too. The hostage didn't see any of it, Ben said. He looked at Beverly like your folks never saw the blood that came out of the drain. Even fruit was everywhere. Yes, she said. They stood looking at each other in the fine spring rain. Mike looked at his watch. There will be bus in 20 minutes or so, he said, or I can take 4 of you in my car if we cream, or I can call some cabs, whatever way you want to do it. I think I'm going to walk from here, Bill said. I don't know where I'm going, but a little fresh air seems like a great idea along about now. I'm going to call a cab, Ben said. I'll share it with you if you'll drop me off downtown, Richie said. Okay, where you going? Richie shrugged. Not really sure yet. The others elected to wait for the bus. 7 tonight, Mike reminded, and be careful, all of you. They agreed to be careful, although Bill did not know how you could truthfully make a promise like that when dealing with such a forbidden array of unknown factors. He started to say so, then looking at their face, and saw that they knew it already. He looked away instead, raising one hand briefly in farewell. The serene air felt good against his face. The walk back to town would be a long one, but that was all right. He had a lot to think about. He was glad that the reunion was over and the business had begun.